All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum's second annual Virtual Archaeology Conference. We're so excited you could join us today, and it looks like people are still coming in, which is so great. My name is Sarah Yamaguchi, and I'm the Public Programs and Volunteer Manager here at the museum. And I'd just like to briefly go over the structure of the webinar so that we all get acquainted with the space today. I'm also joined by Jack Mersick, who is our Office and Communications Coordinator, and he's going to be taking care of any tech needs tonight and making sure it all goes smoothly. So he'll be monitoring the chat, and if you run into any Zoom problems, he would be happy to help you during the webinar. Today's webinar will consist of 5 presentations with time for a brief Q&A in between each one of them. And once all of the presentations have finished, there will be time for a larger Q&A with a chance to revisit any questions that didn't get answered earlier. So if your question doesn't get answered right away, not to fear, we're going to do our best to get to as many as we can. You should be able to access the Q&A function by looking at the bottom of your screen and clicking on the Q&A icon. So this is going to allow you to submit your questions, and we will try to get to all of them. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our Executive Director of the Maritime Museum, Susan Evans-McClure, to get us started today.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are in the homeland and unceded territory of the Abenaki people. The Abenaki have been here since time immemorial and continue to be a thriving Indigenous culture in this region. We acknowledge with gratitude the generations of stewardship, past, present, and future, of all of the Indigenous communities who have and continue to call this land home. I'm Susan Evans-McClure, and I'm the Executive Director of Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. Welcome to our second annual Virtual Archaeology Conference. Through all of our work here at the museum, what we do is connect people to Lake Champlain, inspiring them to learn from the past, build together in the present, and create a sustainable future. The museum is located on a 3-acre waterfront campus just outside of Vergennes, Vermont, on the eastern shores of Lake Champlain. We opened in 1985, and today we welcome around 10,000 students and visitors every year to experience our exhibits, our boat building and rowing programs, and our educational outreach. Our team also conducts new archaeological research, some of which you'll hear about today, and stewards our collection of objects, research materials, and archives, along with the cultural resources at the bottom of Lake Champlain. Our focus here is on the power of history and the power of connection to build strong communities. We believe that all people are history makers, and we want to inspire people to see new possibilities and to build a future that realizes justice for individuals, our communities, and the environment. Over the next 5 years, our region will be commemorating 2 milestone anniversaries. The 200th anniversary of the opening of the Champlain and Erie Canal systems from 2023 to 2025, and then the 250th anniversary of the events of 1776 in 2026. Our unique collections and research expertise at the museum position us well to take a leading role throughout the region in these commemorations, including the work that you'll hear about today. Now, commemorations of major anniversaries often say more about the moment we're currently living in than they do about our past. Our role here at the museum is to bring people together around these anniversaries and help our audiences understand more about themselves, each other, and the community we want to build together. And while we've spent the past 2 years working to remove barriers to access and pursuing new research projects that shine a light on the untold stories of women and people of color in the Champlain Valley, we recognize that there's more work to do to create space, challenge bias, and dismantle the systems that reinforce inequality. We are committed to using our skills as historians, archaeologists, educators, and communicators to make systemic change in our work and in the museum field. Justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion is always at the foundation of our work. Thank you for being part of that and for supporting these efforts. The museum community is supported by hundreds of members who provide the financial support for us to be able to offer many of our programs for free. Many of you joining us today are members already, and thank you for that. Membership starts at $40 for an individual and $115 for a family each year. And your membership support makes all of our work possible. So we hope you'll consider joining as a member today if you're not already. The link to become a member will be in the chat, and we'll include it when we send out a recording of today's program. So thank you for making that work possible. We open for the 2023 season on May 20th, so mark your calendars. I know many of you today are joining us from all around the world, and I hope that you can join us in person here in Vermont sometime soon. And until then, we're offering virtual programs like this one and digital museum visit experiences on our website, where we hope you'll visit us as well. So today, our team and our partners are thrilled to share the research work happening right here on Lake Champlain. And while the events of 1776 and the steamboats of the early 19th century may seem far in the past, I hope that these presentations will remind all of us of how and why this history is still relevant today. The things we're learning now shed new light on the lived experiences of real people in the past. And now we often only learn these stories as maybe heroic victories or stories of men at the helm of ships, but there were other real people involved in all of this. And our goal is to help the public connect to the past through stories of individuals. American history is not and was not preordained. History is made by individuals making decisions and taking action. And when people today make that connection, they start to see themselves as the empowered history makers that they are. And that can even start with a 3D model on your own computer in your own home. So no introduction, of course, would be complete without our long list of thank yous for all the people and organizations who make this work possible. Thank you to the generous funders who support this important work: the National Park Service, American Battlefield Protection Program, the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership, the Lake Champlain Basin Program, the Vermont Arts Council, Vermont Humanities, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, and Jeff and Susan Nelson. Thank you all of you for their generous support that made today's program possible. We would also like to thank the Stockbridge-Munsee Community Band of the Mohican Nation and the Abenaki community for their partnership and support. Thank you to our partners in the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation. And thank you to Dennis and Vicki Hopper and Annie Hopper and Sean Willerford for providing access to their land on Arnold's Bay. Thank you to the many individuals who have donated historic objects to the museum's collection related to these eras that we're studying. You would be amazed at what people have in their homes and their attics and their basements related to our local history. Although maybe you wouldn't be, because all of us have amazing connections to this work. We're so grateful for those community members who come to us and share that history so that we can make it part of the historical record and part of the work that we do. Thank you also to artist and longtime friend of the museum, Ernie Haas. Ernie's incredible paintings allow us to visualize the maritime history of Lake Champlain, and you will be seeing many of his works today. Thank you also to the many volunteers who dedicate their time and expertise to our research efforts, including Craig Allen, Ellen and Gary Lefebvre, and interns Chelsea Cohen and Ian Shoemaker. Thank you especially to Ed Skolin, who you'll be hearing from today, who has graciously made his expertise, time, and resources available as a volunteer team member on many of these research projects. Thank you, of course, to our entire research and archaeology team of Christopher Sabick, Sherilyn Gilligan, Paul Gates, and Patricia Reed for spearheading this work. And thank you to our team members today who are making this virtual magic happen: Sarah Yamaguchi, Jack Mersick, Catherine Noiva, and Meg Salox. And most importantly, thank all of you, already up to 223 of you, which for us here in the kind of middle of nowhere, Vermont, is a little mind-blowing. But thank you all for being here today and for learning with us together. Now I'm going to pass things over to Chris Sabick to get started. Chris, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for that opening remark, Susan. I'm going to carry on with the first presentation today, which is going to be about the use of small ROVs and how they were applied to the wreck of the gunboat Spitfire. So let me go ahead and get that going here. Okay. All right, this presentation I'm giving today is actually something that was originally presented by Kotaro Yamafune at the Society for Historical Archaeology conference in Portugal this January. And I asked Kota to participate in this program, and he mentioned that he was incredibly busy, as he often is, traveling around the world doing photogrammetry all over the place. So he sent me his presentation, and I've heavily adapted it, let's say, so that it fits our presentation here of what we're talking about today. So any mistakes that are included in this presentation are entirely mine, and I'm sure that Kota could do this much better than I could, but I'm going to have a stab at it here and talk about ROV-based photogrammetry survey methods and its application to the gunboat Spitfire. You know, in the last decade, or 5 years specifically, the availability of relatively affordable small ROVs, which are sometimes referred to as underwater drones, have become much more prevalent. Just as there's been a huge expansion in the use of aerial drones, there has been a mirrored growth in the underwater drone industry as well. And there's a number of advantages to using these type of platforms compared to the much more expensive, much larger systems that are used in extremely high tech and high budget survey methodology. These units are often quite small in comparison to those larger units. They're quite easy to control. Even someone of my age was able to learn to fly the ROV pretty quickly. They all come with a dedicated controller, which is very much like a game controller, and in some cases is a game controller. So it's very intuitive to figure out how to use these things. They're extremely maneuverable, much more so than even full-priced ROVs from a decade ago. They're quick to deploy and recover, and as I mentioned at the beginning, above all, they're extremely affordable. Now, they're not a dedicated platform for doing scientific research, of course. So we do have to make some adaptation to this technology to make them useful for collecting photogrammetry data. The cameras that come with these ROVs and their built-in lighting systems are certainly adequate for maneuvering the unit around and observing the bottom and doing inspections and things of that nature. But they're not powerful enough, or there aren't enough of them to be useful for photogrammetry. So we're certainly talking about attaching external cameras and lights to our system. And as we found out in some of our operations, it's definitely a good idea to have a second ROV with you. Can help get you out of a lot of potential problems, and it's also very helpful for capturing imagery of your other ROV doing work, which we'll have a chance to see some of later. During the course of the pandemic, Coda, who is quite often traveling around the world doing photogrammetry, found himself, like the rest of us, stuck at home for a couple of years. And while he used that opportunity to make a lot of connections, both in underwater survey industry and with educational, higher educational facilities and personnel in Japan. And they began working on a method for deploying these affordable underwater drones to collect photogrammetry data. And what we're going to talk about today is how we got from the image on the left here, which is the device that Coda and his team helped to develop in Japan. And the one on the right here is the unit that we actually deployed to document the Spitfire. The Coda and his team, worked for the better part of 2020 in developing a system that could be used with the Chasing M2 underwater drone, which is this yellow one that you see here, and which is also the one that the Maritime Museum purchased. And they determined that for their application, the best way to adapt the system was to suspend a number of diffuse light sources beneath the ROV, as well as at least 4 GoPro cameras, and then apply some additional flotation to the top of the vehicle, which would help to counteract the additional weight that they had attached to the bottom. And here is the structure that they worked out for attaching to the bottom of the ROV with all the lights and cameras that they could attach to it. The idea here being that they were trying to get the maximum amount of data with the least amount of passes over any object. And as this diagram suggests, with the cameras oriented in 3 different directions, even at moving in one plane across an object, your cameras are hitting it from 3 different angles, and therefore, gathering a significant amount of data from multiple angles that would be good for creating a photogrammetry model. Now, I will point out real quick that, as you probably saw from the ROV that we used here on Lake Champlain, we only had 2 cameras. So I would say that we were using the blue and the red cones in this image, one that basically pointed down and one that pointed forward and slightly down. But we just plan to operate the drone in both directions to make sure that we got data from all sides of our objects that we were trying to document. They did a considerable amount of pool testing with their system. Don't need to hear that. You know, I think they were able to really adjust the buoyancy and get the flotation correct, the amount of additional flotation they needed, and do some good in-water testing before they took it out into the field and tried it in real field conditions. And the first big project that they tried with it was to scan the remains of a 1927 Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer called the Werribee, which sits in about 97 meters of water. And you can see it's quite a sizable wreck. It's about 150 feet long, and they were able to document this with the device that's shown here in the upper left-hand corner, all of those additional lights and cameras. Beyond this wreck site, they also did some work on geological and seabed features. The canyon one that you see in the top picture and in the picture on the right is the photogrammetry model of it, is a combination of photogrammetry data and multi-beam sonar data, which has produced this really impressive model, particularly the rendered version on the right. I really love the way that that's turned out. The other seabed operation that they carried out, you know, was a pretty flat, uniform featured or featureless plane that they were documenting. And for these applications, this multi-camera, multi-light setup was really a good system. They're relatively horizontal features. They didn't require a lot of maneuvering up and down with the ROV to capture the data, which is not necessarily the case with what we had to do in Lake Champlain. So Coda wasn't able to bring the device with him over to Lake Champlain when he came over in 2022 to do some work with us, but he brought his knowledge and his expertise, and he helped us to modify our chasing M to collect photogrammetry data. As I mentioned before, we attached 2 GoPros to this system. We used GoPro Hero 9s with deep water housings. Again, one is pointed forward and slightly down, and the other one is more vertical, but still not quite straight up and down. The image here shows we have 4 lights attached to it, and these are actually relatively cheap dive lights that you can find on Amazon for about $75 a piece. They're dirt cheap, and they produce a tremendous amount of light, about 20,000 lumens. We did eventually swap some of those out for slightly less powerful, but higher quality 12,000 lumen lights from Big Blue. And those we had diffusers on. We'll probably see those in some pictures in the future. Those are all mounted to ball mounts that are strapped to the outside of the ROV. That's another advantage of the Chasing M2 ROV, is that it has these rails down the side that are very easy to attach a lot of this additional lighting and cameras to. We did everything with still photography, and we were using the time-lapse feature on the GoPros, capturing an image every half second. As you can see here, the image format, if you are using the flat port like you see on our ROV in this picture, you use a wide angle image format. We did do some experimenting with putting a dome port over the lens, and in that case, we preferred to use the linear mode. Within the GoPro cameras themselves, you can fix the white balance into the warmest setting. You can lock the auto rotation on the images, and Coda was able to actually calibrate these cameras manually. We spent a day doing some diving in the pool down the street from the museum with a huge grid. You know, he had made basically a big checkerboard that he was using all these cameras on, that he could then take those images back and adjust them and determine what the best calibration for each of those cameras was. And that could be input into Metashape, the software that we would use to create the models when the time came. So here again is a couple of pictures of the ROV we used. The picture on the right there, you can see that's one of the big blue lights in the foreground that has a diffuser attached to it. And in that picture, you can see better the additional flotation that we added to this ROV to counteract the additional lights and cameras. So in all these pictures I've been showing you of this chasing M2, it's upside down, right? When it's operating, those cameras are going to be pointed down and that flotation is going to be on the top. Okay, let's see here. As far as the methodology for capturing images, this is very similar to CODA's standard methodology for collecting data with a handheld camera. You start by surrounding your target with what's called a locking path or a bounding box. That's the red line around the outside. Do a full path around your target, and then begin doing the crosshatch back and forth. And then once you're done with both the transverse and longitudinal path, you can go back to any particular features and circle around them in more detail to capture their three-dimensional nature. When it came to working on the Spitfire, we modified this plan to so much, or I should say that we used this process, but we applied it to only portions of the boat at the same time. We did the forward portions of the boat, we did the stern section of the boat, and then we did the middle with the mast as a separate with a separate boat positioning and a separate effort, just to make sure that we were reducing our entanglement hazards. To do the work that we did in the summer in 2022, we used the vessel known as the RV Amazon, which was very kindly donated to the project by Gary and Ellen Lefebvre, who also crewed and participated in the project with us. And frankly, this project could not have happened without their expertise and their skills, and we're extremely grateful for their assistance. Gary also has a couple of other ROVs. As you can see in this picture, he's got the fee fish there, and that proved to be very handy to have as well. And one of the really important features of Gary's platform here is this spot locking trolling motor that's seen here on the bow of the vessel. This allowed us to position the boat exactly where we wanted it, and the trolling motor would hold its position to within 5 feet of the point we designated, so we could deploy the ROV without having to first anchor the boat into position. And that made our operations much more efficient and accurate. That trolling motor is produced by Minn Kota, and of course I had to get a picture of Big Kota with the Mini Kota. We came to call it the Mini Kota, and Kota had to get a picture with it. This is the crew at work on the site, and in addition to Gary and Ellen, myself. In this picture, we have George Schwartz and Dr. Krevin Chrisman. They were along for the early part of operations, and our real ringer was this gentleman, whose name I'm going to attempt here. It's Yasumasa Ikikawa, or as we called him, Yasu. This is someone that Kota worked with in Japan extensively in the development of these systems. Yasu is a professional drone pilot, not only underwater drones, but also aerial drones, amongst a number of other talents that he has. And the data collection was greatly facilitated by his expertise. You can see in the main picture on this slide, that's me inside the cabin with Gary looking at me, looking over my shoulder closely, looking down and actually driving the ROV. The first day that we operated on the Spitfire, Yasu collected the data in the stern of the boat. I collected data in the bow of the boat. And then as Kota processed that data, did a preliminary processing of that data in the afternoon, once we got off the water, it came to find out that Yasu's data was fantastic and mine was not. I was staying too far away from the wreck and not following the contours of the site as closely enough. So his experience and skill was certainly evident right from the get-go. And here we'll just watch a short video clip of the ROV working here above the Spitfire site. Again, this is where a second ROV comes in handy. This is Gary's Fish V6 that's filming the chasing M2 with the cameras and the lights as it does its work above the Spitfire site. Of course, here we're above the bow gun at the very forward end of the gunboat. And you can see how those powerful lights are really great at illuminating the site. But you can see how quickly that light drops off too, which is why it's so important to be as close to the wreck as possible without disturbing the sediment. You can get an idea of some of the particulate matter that's already floating around in Lake Champlain. The last thing that we need to do is to stir more up. It's a delicate balance between being close enough to the target and not making a big mess. As I mentioned previously, this site in particular, there was lots of ups and downs and in-betweens. The compact nature of the underwater drones was very useful here, and the ability to, approach the vessel from the outside, go up, over the rail, back down, across the inside of the vessel to the other rail, up and over that rail, systematically and consistently was very important in getting good data. And one of the things that I was absolutely most impressed with was Yasu's ability to capture the data for modeling of the mast, and then Coda's ability to translate that into a functional model. One of the things that photogrammetry is often not that great at is collecting data on long, thin objects like a mast. But Coda and Yasu had developed a system where, first the ROV traveled up and down a section of mast and then rotated and then went up and down again, rotated up and down again. And then also a secondary path where as it went up, it went around 2/3 of the way, up a little bit, around 2/3 of the way, up a little bit, around 2/3 of the way. Very impressive and very effective. You can see here we're up at the top of the mainmast, and this is the trestle tree, or that has been disturbed in the past, probably by a downrigger ball. You can see how it's canted at a weird angle, and we'll be able to see that better in the model as well. And this is the model that Coda was able to produce, or these are stills from the model that Coda was able to produce from the data he collected. Or that Yasu and he collected. We captured just shy of 30,000 images over the course of 3 days of operation on the Spitfire. Coda let me know that just aligning those 30,000 photos took 6 days for his computer to chew on, and that was before he had to build the mesh and do the texture. So it's an enormous data set, but he was able to process them all at once as opposed to doing it in chunks and then trying to assemble the chunks, which anyone that's done photogrammetry can tell you can be more challenging than it would seem like it should be. So by doing it all in one big model, it did take a while, but was able to produce a really beautiful, seamless model. Obviously the image on the left is the true colors. It was captured by the cameras. I think that one weakness of the GoPro system is that it's not all, the white balance is, even though if you fix it, it's still not capturing true colors as efficiently as a higher resolution handheld camera would, but still did a pretty impressive job. And of course, these rendered versions that Coda produced of the site are, I think, at least as impressive and very impactful. So I'm very pleased with the way that this model came out. He did an amazing job, and now we can use this model for planning for future operations on and around the Spitfire. We've already been in consultation with Peter Fix and Ben Yosei, who are working on the Philadelphia project for the Smithsonian, where the sister ship to the Spitfire is the Philadelphia. And we've had a good discussion about some of the similarities and differences we noticed between this boat and the Philadelphia. So it's already proven to be a very useful tool in many different ways. I'm going to go ahead and pop out of this Oh, I forgot about this. Coda, we worked really hard all day. It was nice and warm out on that boat, and on one of the boat rides back, he was taking a little nap here. But one of the great discussions we had was how do you scale things in photogrammetry when you're using an ROV? And Coda spent a lot of time thinking about this, and we had a lot of interesting discussions about it. When we do photogrammetry with a handheld camera, with divers, we often place scale bars on or around our site. And with those, instruments of a known dimension, if they're included in your data set, then you can tell the photogrammetry software exactly how big that ruler or that scale bar is, and it will constrain the model to that scale. And that's how you have an accurate model that you can then go in and take measurements from if you need to, and they will be to scale. So the question is, how do you deploy a scale bar at depth? We're working in beyond recreational dive limits here, so it's deep water. Coda was really interested in trying to develop some kind of biodegradable scale that we could drop and then leave, drop with the ROV and then leave there, and it would dissolve or get eaten by fish or something like that, but would be included in the data set. So I think that Coda even went as far as trying to make a candy cane of a certain size that he could deploy, and I don't think it ended up working out real well. But so this is something we're still trying to figure out exactly how to scale these models in deep water from these low-cost ROVs. But you guys have any thoughts on that? I'd be happy to hear about it. I'm going to hop out of here and share with you the model itself. This model is up on Sketchfab at the Maritime Museum's page on Sketchfab, which is the 3D model hosting service that we use. And let's just have a quick stroll around here. One of the things I absolutely love is being able to look down on this model from the masthead. Gives you a really interesting perspective, and I think it's also really effective at demonstrating how much this portion of the mast has been impacted. When the boat was found in 1997, the trestle tree was horizontal and was not canted like this. And we do believe that it was probably snagged by a downrigger ball, which dislocated the trestle and has caused the top mast to drop down about 8 inches. And this was our main entanglement hazard when we were working around the site, and why we were so careful about using that spot locking GPS to put us into a position to minimize the likelihood of the tether for the ROV getting snagged into this delicate structure at the top of the mast. Because this is up in about, well, it's in 100-ish feet of water, this portion of the mast. So it's still deep, still not something we want to get tangled in. Of course, we don't want to cause any damage to this site. One thing that becomes readily apparent when we look at this model is the amount of aquatic weeds that have accumulated in the site. That's what all these masses of material, both inside the hull and accumulated on the outside of the hull, represent. These seem to be masses of aquatic weeds that get washed out of shallower bays near shore, and they roll like a tumbleweed across the bottom of the lake, and they snag on the structure of the shipwreck. And certainly obscure some details. There's more than likely details underneath these masses of vegetation that we're missing in this model. These aquatic weeds also seem to be the vector for zebra mussels, an invasive species of mussel that we have here on Lake Champlain and in the Great Lakes and all the other freshwater lakes in North America. But they seem to be present in these weed masses, and as they roll along the bottom, they collect on the wreck, and then the zebra mussels transfer themselves from the rotting weed mass and onto the vessel. There's not a huge colonization of zebra mussels on the Spitfire at this point. It is deeper than their preferred habitat range, so it seems that the mussels stay alive on the wreck, but they don't seem to be reproducing in quantity in the way they do in shallow water. So we're extremely happy with how this model turned out, and it's going to be very useful in future planning, collaboration with our partners at the Smithsonian and elsewhere. And I think it's a great way for non-divers and non-archaeologists to interact with this really important historic site remotely. All right, I'm going to close out of that. I can here. Jack, you might need to boot me out again. Okay, thank you. So that is our first presentation for today. And the second presentation we're going to have today is presented by Dr. George Schwartz, who's an underwater archaeologist at Navy History and Heritage Command. And George is going to be speaking to us about the paddle wheels from the Steamboat Phoenix, which we were able to get out and do some work on just before we did this work on the Spitfire, and using some of the same technology. So very excited for Dr. Schwartz to present to you about the paddle wheels from the Steamboat Phoenix. All yours, George.
All right, thank you, Chris. So just a caveat, if my audio cuts out, somebody, Sarah or somebody, just let me know. I may have to move, but we'll give it a shot. Okay, so I'm here to talk about some pretty amazing finds in Lake Champlain. And a lot of you know, but for those of you that aren't aware, besides being riddled with hundreds of shipwrecks, some from the earliest of U.S. naval battles, Lake Champlain is the home of the remains of the earliest steamboat for which we have any archaeological example in the world, as far as we know. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about this Steamboat Phoenix, which is from the turn of the 19th century, when steamboats were really just starting to take hold in the United States. So I'll start first by talking very briefly about the advent of steam navigation in North America. And really, the advent of steam technology in terms of propulsion for vessels reaches back several hundred years. But really, it wasn't until the end of the 18th century where all these advances in technology and ingenuity sort of culminated in these really viable steamboats that could be used. And it's just at this time that they start to take hold. And really, this began in the northeastern rivers and inland seas of the U.S. as far as the development in America. And this is because this was where a concentration of technologies and materials was. Shortly thereafter, it spread into the western rivers and then eventually into the Great Lakes. But you can see this map of the eastern United States and all of these concentrations of obviously of cities, but also rivers. But there's mountains and there's things that separated different sort of cultures and communities. And so the advent of the steamboat really led to this more readily available form of transportation and sort of exchange of cultures and ideas and goods and so forth. And so I'm really going to focus on the inland seas and the northeastern rivers again, because this is kind of where it all started. But really in New York, in the Hudson River and some other tributaries and rivers of New York is where a lot of these early experiments began with regard to the successful steamboats. And just at the turn of the 19th century, they, as I mentioned, they became viable and commercially successful. But what happened is a monopoly was obtained in New York waters. And so a lot of these developers and shipwrights had to move out of New York to try to develop steamboats elsewhere. And so some of these actually went to Lake Champlain and into Vermont. And so what you see here on the left are a couple of paintings by a local artist that was mentioned earlier, Ernie Haas. So these are amazing paintings, and he's sort of depicted how some of these early steamboats that were built in Lake Champlain, how they looked and what the shipyards looked like. And the one in the middle is an archival rendition from a patent So this was a big deal at the time. And what we have are sort of these canal boats that are fitted with steam machinery and technology, and they function very well in some of these rivers. And the earliest ones in Lake Champlain were also built that way. But actually, the only one, the first one that was built there, was built along those lines. But shortly thereafter, this group of investors came together and formed the Lake Champlain Steamboat Company. And they developed this vessel Phoenix, which was a steamboat that was a little bit of a departure from some of these canal boats that were fitted out with steam machinery, in that it was built along the lines of a seagoing vessel. So this is one that is kind of unique in that it's probably one of the first that really combined the characteristics of a sailing vessel with a steam vessel. So kind of unique in that sense. It was a passenger steamer. It was built in 1814 and launched in 1815, and it served for about 5 seasons in Lake Champlain as a passenger steamer, traveling between New York and Quebec. And it
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I think that George may have frozen. So I am going to ask Chris, we're going to ask, we'll figure out what's going on with George. But in the meantime, Chris Savick, will you jump back in? Because I think we forgot the Q&A and there were some great questions in the chat. And then we'll have someone reach out to George and get him to fix the internet. All of it. We'll see.
Happy to do that. And yes, I apologize
Thanks,
for
Chris.
breezing right through my question and answer area without pausing. So we'll figure out what's going on with George and we'll get back to it. I did see a couple of questions come up in the question and answer section. And if you have any other ones about the Spitfire project, please go ahead and put them in there, and I'll just answer these ones real quick as we go. Chris Farr asks mentions that our capture rate was 1 frame every half second. That's right. What was the speed of the drone? Well, it's we didn't have a designated speed that we used. Slow and methodical is really the answer. Right, with photogrammetry, you're looking for maximum overlap of your images to create the best model. So while we didn't have a specific speed, it was slower than walking speed, I guess is the best way I would put it. And really depended on how intricate the structure was we were working around. Getting in and around the breech end of the bow gun, that's pretty tight on either side of the gun there in the bow. So that took a little extra time and a little extra coordination. Chris McLean asked if there were muscles on the Spitfire, and I covered this a little bit. There are some muscles. They seem to have been carried there by those weed mats that came in. And lastly, Robert asks if we will eventually raise the Spitfire and what the size of the boat was and any additional guns. Let me take those in a different order. The estimated dimensions of the Spitfire are pretty much identical to that of the Philadelphia, which is 54 feet long and 15 feet wide. There were 8 of these gunboats that were built in 1776, and they were all on the basic same design. It did originally have 3 cannon on board. Only the bow gun remains. We assume there were originally 2 guns that faced off to either side, or 1 gun that faced off to either side in the waist of the boat. And those may have been dumped overboard as the boat retreated from the Battle of Valcour Island in an effort to try to keep it afloat as long as possible. Plans to raise the Spitfire? Not at this point. Though it's not precluded from happening in the future. Our plans right now are focused more on continuing to study the site and potentially doing some in-water excavation and documentation in the future. But that does not, but leaving the wreck in place, but that does not preclude its potential future raising if that's something that wanted to be tackled sometime in the future. And Emily asked how big the ROV is. I wish I had it here to show you. I don't know. It's about 18 inches long and maybe 10 inches wide. It's quite small, but a powerful little device. Okay, that's all the questions I'm seeing now, unless anybody else has something. So we have George back. I see his name there.
Yeah, it looks like he moved locations.
Okay. Hey, George.
Hi, I apologize, but I had a feeling that was going to happen. Now somebody needs to tell me where it cut out because I actually don't know.
Oh, that's a good question.
But I'm talking
It
about
was
the
right
sea-
when you were talking about the 5 seasons that the Phoenix served on going back between New York and Quebec.
And Quebec,
That's where we
yes.
left you.
All right. Technology.
And if there are any more questions for me, I'm happy to have those at the end of the presentation. We're going to have a longer Q&A with all the panelists. Okay, thank you, George. Carry on.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that, everybody. So I'll jump right into it. So Phoenix ended up burning. We all know that. There was a candle left burning between 2 shelves in the pantry, which quickly spread throughout the vessel. There was a gale, as I mentioned. There was a strong wind that was coming in, and so really there was this huge conflagration that ended up in a great loss. But of the 46 passengers, the first boat was filled up to its capacity, and they got all of those people off board. And then the second boat was filled about halfway, and somebody panicked and they cut the ropes, the lines that were attaching the boat to the vessel. And so that left 12 people stranded on Phoenix. The captain, Richard Sherman, he called for the ship to be abandoned. They ended up throwing some materials off the boat, like desks and things like that, something that they can cling on to. And 6 people ended up dying. The captain swam to a nearby stave island, but the rest of the vessel kind of went out of control and was, completely on fire. The mast was burned, and so it went out of control. It ended up drifting for a while until it ended up in its current resting place, which is off of Colchester Shoal in the lake. And so it was more or less forgotten about for 160 years or so, until the late 70s, when one group among some others just rediscovered the vessel. And the Champlain Maritime Society went out. You can see Art Cohn here, as it was a former director of the Maritime Museum, as well as Kevin Chrisman, who's now a professor at Texas A&M, were part of this team that went out and documented Phoenix. They spent about a week down there, created a really nice site plan, and their efforts led to this being the first underwater archaeology preserve in Vermont. So some enormous achievements there. And then, and so what that meant, being an underwater preserve, is that you could dive these sites, and it was opened up to the public, and there was, they were trying to get the information out there, and we're very successful at that. And then, if you fast forward about 30 years, I and a team of other students and archaeologists revisited the site with an effort toward studying the ship construction features, the hull design. And spending a little more focus on the placement of the steam machinery and other things. So we spent about a total of about 4 weeks on the site documenting it, and you can see down on the bottom left, I think Chris was talking a little bit about zebra mussels, but there definitely are some zebra mussels on the wreck of Phoenix. Phoenix is on this shoal, this reef, which is about in between about 60 and 100 feet of water. So there are varying depths, and at the uppermost part of it, toward the bow, there are quite a few zebra mussels. So there was some urgency into studying this and recording it as much as possible now. And you can see these down on the bottom left again, and our team working off of Stave Island. So from this, we created an updated site plan, a bunch of other drawings. We were able to record the curvature of the hull by taking sections of a number of the frames along the length of the vessel, created a few models. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about the steam machinery and or I guess the lack of steam machinery. So as you can see here, there are no paddle wheels, no indication that this is even a steamboat, really. What we have, though, are some engine bed timbers, which we documented in pretty good detail. And you can see that, these are pretty large timbers that were along the length of the hull. And while there was no steam machinery, there were a lot of fasteners and pipes, copper pipes, and other things. And we knew what kind of engine it had. We didn't know exactly where it was placed, but we could kind of deduce it from evidence such as brick and ash that still existed and the mortises in the bed timbers. But also down on the left side of this site plan on the bottom right-hand side, you see this bearing block. And we took note of that and recorded it. It was a pillow block or bearing block that I'll get back to in a little while, but just to mention that it was one of the only remnants of many other kind of artifact on the vessel. So from this, we were able to take the data, create some models, and even understand a little bit about the compartmentalization of Phoenix and where things would have been hypothetically based on archival research, records of the Lake Champlain Steamboat Company. Even though there's no hull lines or any kind of design papers left from this period, there was a lot that we could deduce from existing data. And we created some conjectural lines and construction drawings. So after that, there's been continued study on this site. And in 2015, we revisited it to basically see if there were any other extant artifacts or remains that were proud of the seabed that weren't in between the frames that could be documented. And again, we saw that pillow block that was down there. It's pretty heavy. We documented it again where it was. And then in 2019, we went back and we tried to do a little bit of photogrammetric modeling of the site, and we got a little bit of data there, but decided we needed to come back. It's a huge vessel. It's still about 150 feet of the hull remains, so we needed some more time. And right after that is when this new discovery took place. And Gary Lefebvre has already been mentioned here a couple times, but he was out on his vessel. And here you can see where we are in Lake Champlain, between Vermont and New York. And you see the Phoenix wreck site in the top right. So he was out in that vicinity and kind of running his sonar in that area. And he found these two really interesting objects about 3/4 of a mile or so away from the Phoenix wreck. And he didn't know what they were. They were these large kind of discs that looked to be half buried in the lake bottom. And so he took his ROV and sent it down and got some images and some video. And he then contacted Chris at the Maritime Museum and kind of like trying to figure out what these were. And after looking at it and knowing that the Phoenix wreck was nearby, I had a conversation with him as well as Kevin Chrisman, and we looked at these and said, these really look like they could be the paddle wheels from Phoenix, which is quite amazing. Even though they were pretty far from the wreck site, there was nothing else down there like this. So a pretty amazing, intriguing find. And this is pretty significant because we don't really have anything like this on any other vessel from this period, these early steamboats. And so we have drawings, we have some conjectural hypothetical reconstructions, but we didn't really have any hard data. And there aren't too many of these in the archaeological record as well. From the first quarter of the 19th century, there's really only a handful of steamers or vessels that were built along the lines of steamers. You have Vermont that was built earlier than Phoenix, but it was pulled out of the river, the Richelieu River, in the 1950s, and it was meant to go to a museum, but that never materialized, and the hull basically rotted away. So we have a little bit of documentation from that, but again, there's no remnants of the steam machinery. Ticonderoga was actually built by the Lake Champlain Steamboat Company. before Phoenix, but this was during the American-British War of 1812. And so it was kind of more or less confiscated by the US Navy and turned into a war schooner. So even though it was documented archaeologically, there was nothing along the lines of steam machinery or anything like that. There's a Canadian vessel, Lady Sherbrooke, which was built around the same time and studied in the St. Lawrence River. But again, no remnants other than the engine bed timbers and the same kind of materials that we found on Phoenix. And then amazingly, Phoenix 2 was also found and studied to a very high degree, but again, no indication of propulsion system, much less the paddle wheels. So this is pretty unique. So then we say, well, when do we start to see paddle wheels in the archaeological record? And really, you kind of have to jump forward to the 1830s until we find something that actually has the remains of paddle wheels that have been archaeologically excavated. And this is a Western River steamboat, so very, very different type of design construction. But nevertheless, this is sort of where we have the remnants of the steam machinery. So this was studied by the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, Texas A&M University, and they actually have some remnants of this in a museum in Oklahoma. A very nice display. A lot of drawings were produced. There was a lot of material there. But among these, I just want to point out down on the bottom right, all those pieces of hardware down there are actually these pillow blocks that I had mentioned before. A number of these were recovered and recorded. And essentially what they are, they were bearings for the paddle wheel shaft. And they were of different designs because Heroin actually had flywheel as well. So there were a number of these used for different purposes. But I'll get back to that again in just a little bit. So back to the discovery. We were amazed to find that we may actually have the paddle wheels of Phoenix on the bottom of Lake Champlain. These were much deeper, in about 180 feet or so, and so not easily diveable. And when this discovery came to our attention, we decided it would be a really good idea to document these in as much detail as we possibly could. And some of this was through the ROV photogrammetry, which Chris talked about in detail previously. So we wanted to do that, but we also thought, well, if these paddle wheels are this far away from the wreck, there's potential for other things to be in this vicinity. So what we decided to do was to create a survey box that encompassed our hypothetical trajectory of the wreck. So we knew which direction they were going. We knew where the location of the wreck is. We knew which direction the wind was coming, and we know the location of the paddle wheels. So we wanted to see if there was anything else that might be in the way. So the first year, we just wanted to put eyes on the paddle wheel, and thanks to Ed Scullin and the use of his boat and equipment, we went out and we put an ROV down on the site. But really, what we wanted to do is revisit the wreck site one more time and take a look at this bearing block, because we really did have some remnants of the steam machinery and paddle wheels. We wanted to take a closer look at this bearing block and potentially recover it. So that's exactly what we ended up doing. We went down to the site and we did some photogrammetry to, get a little bit more documentation of where that pillow block was. And then we went down and rigged it up. I don't know why, but maybe see the video. Videos aren't working, unfortunately. No, it's not going to work. Okay. So anyway, we recovered that pillow block. We took it to the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, the conservation lab, and we started to clean it up before it goes into conservation. And we got to see some of the details of this block. And you can see that groove in the middle, which is where a brass bearing would have been, and the paddle wheel shaft would have gone on top of that. You can see the fastener holes at the bottom where it would have been bolted to the bed timber below it. And there were some other details that we were able to uncover after it was completely cleaned and going through conservation. You can also see that on the bottom middle picture, it's kind of broken on the one side there. So there is some question as to whether or not this was a repair or something else that was, maybe it was the original one that was broken off and then discarded, still in the hull. We're still kind of looking into that. But if you look at the pillow blocks on the left, these are from Heroin, and then look at what we had, you can kind of see how these were shaped and how they were used. And on that image on the right-hand side, you see how it would have kind of fit into the whole assembly. It would have been on top of that bearing, that's cylinder timber, and the paddle wheel shaft gone on top of that. And then there would have been a cap that went on top of it. I believe there's actually a Sketchfab link to this as well, so you can see the cleaned version of this and kind of spin it around in Sketchfab on the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum website. So then going back to our objectives for recording the paddle wheels, we wanted to do the photogrammetric recording. We also wanted to do a sonar survey and we wanted to do a magnetometer survey, so that if there was anything on the lake floor that was maybe a little bit buried but iron, such as a capstan or another piece of hardware, we may be able to detect it. So the first thing we did is pretty much what Chris described in the previous presentation. We used the same 3M small ROV, which we just loaded with cameras and was dripping with lights. And we were able to, again, to use Gary's RV Amazon for this project. And we went out to the site, and essentially what Gary did is he had his 5-fish ROV of a similar size and was able to put it down on, we would get over the top of the paddle wheel site, and he could essentially put his ROV down, make sure we're in the right spot, and it kind of like used his as a guide to get down to the site so that we could then record the paddle wheels. You can see how intense Chris is. This is actually kind of a little bit sketchy in a way, because you can see the tether. Of course, we have an ROV recording an ROV, but you see that ROV there, and you see you'll see that there are some flanges and arms of this paddle wheel that you can get snagged in. So and we needed to get close, as Chris described in the previous presentation. In order to really get good photogrammetry data, you have to be close. You have to have a lot of lights. So sorry that these videos aren't working, but this is supposed to be ROV video from our photogrammetry, but you can at least see here what we have. So we have a fairly complete paddle wheel. You see the arms, there are flanges that are buried, and then the other half of the paddle wheel is actually buried underneath the mud, so which is probably extremely well preserved. What you're seeing here are the arms and some of these slots, and that's where the buckets would have been, which are gone. There's supposed to be a video here too, but what you see here is some of the structure. So in addition to these paddle wheels, connected to it is actually hull remains in a pretty significant, substantial amount from what we're able to see. So here's some of the photogrammetry showing you the paddle wheel, one of the paddle wheels, and its hull components that are attached to it. So on the left, you can kind of see the top. We're looking down into the paddle wheels, and then the wooden structure around it is actually the framing that went around the paddle wheel. And you can see a little better here. So we have a model of Phoenix based on the archaeological data, and then our hypothetical location of the paddle wheels. And what you see is that there are actually substantial hull remains of the guard. And this guard is this timber that wrapped around a pretty good portion of the outside of the hull to literally guard the paddle wheels. And there are also through beams that would go across the hull that penetrated the deck and went out and supported this guard. So what you're seeing here is actual pieces of the guard, they're charred, which is really interesting. You can see that they were burned. And then you also see these paddle wheel beams that went through and supported the guard. And then that, of course, would have been planked over as well. So these are really intriguing. And in terms of the measuring and the scaling, as Chris had mentioned previously, it's kind of a challenge because you don't want to litter a bunch of wreck sites with permanent scales. And so we're still trying to figure out sort of the best way to do that. But in this case, we were kind of lucky because there was a 5-gallon bucket, which you can kind of see on that top image. It was literally had been there for who knows how long. We went down, you could see that 5-gallon bucket. And so we were able, since we know those dimensions, we were able to use that as a bit of a scale. You kind of see a close-up version. As Chris also mentioned, the photogrammetry is not very good at basically creating models of very thin structures, such as the braces, the iron braces that were really quite thin, going around or basically supporting the arms of the paddle wheel. So we hope to go back and do a little bit more work on that. But in terms of the magnetometer survey, we have a huge area to survey, but this past year we did actually get out and survey directly over the paddle wheels and then extended that, a good ways beyond it in either direction. And essentially we found we were using the INA marine magnetometer over the site. And we found that there were, as expected, some fairly good magnetic variations directly over the paddle wheels. But beyond that, we're not really sure. There were some anomalies, but this is fairly deep. So we really kind of need to dig a little bit deeper to find out if those are anything or not. But that data can be used in conjunction with the other survey that we did while we were out there, which was a multi-beam survey. And this actually went along really well. We insonified the entire area that we were interested in, and on another vessel that was out there while we were, which was fixed with a high resolution multi-beam. And there were a number 9 and 10, you can see on the right hand side, those are actually the paddle wheels. And then there are a number of other targets that are of interest that we will probably go back and look at with the ROVs. And this is just an image of the multi-beam, one of the paddle wheels. You can see the depression that it's in. A couple more images. So at this point, I feel like we've done a pretty good job documenting what's down there. We can probably go back and get a little bit more, refined data, but so far, very, very productive. And what we want to do is go back and do the more extensive magnetometer survey and really ground truth some of those targets in the multi-beam survey and see what lines up with the magnetometer data. And then go back, and if there's anything down there, record it in much the same way we did the paddle wheels. And then beyond that, go back to the Phoenix site itself and do a more complete photogrammetry model of that, so that we can kind of put these different models together and sort of get a better understanding of how everything went together. So that's where we are right now. I thank everybody for your patience in my technical difficulties here, but I also want to thank Gary and Ellen Lefebvre for their assistance on this project, as well as Ed Scullin, and of course Coda and Dr. Tom Manley from this marine research company who helped us out with the multi-beam. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you for that, George. That was great. We have some questions coming in from people who want to know more about the steamboats. So it looks like we have time to get to some of those. One person asks, did the Phoenix roll over and dump the paddle wheels, or were they connected by a wooden shaft that burned in half?
That's a really good question. We don't know. In fact, it would have been, it had an iron shaft, but what we don't really know is when they fell off. We were pretty amazed that they were even there. We sort of figured they just burned up because there was no indication of it at all. And again, in the other archaeological examples that we have, there's nothing. So that we're not really sure. It didn't keel over because Phoenix is upright. It continued to burn down to the water line and then eventually sank. But when the paddle wheels fell off, they became inverted. So we know they burned a little bit because we see the charred remains of the guard, which means that the fire was obviously, it had a effect on them. But as they sank, they did flip over, and something I wanted to mention when you saw those, and if you could see the video, you could see it a little better, but those paddle wheels are actually, they had flipped upside down. And we know that because of the way we documented the fasteners and also the planking. There was still actually existing deck planking on those guards and beams. And so we know just because of how they were situated that it was upside down.
Great, thank you, George. We have another question about steamboats. Someone is wondering what museum is the steamship Heroine in?
Oh, it's in, actually, there's probably other people on this chat that could answer that, but it's in a museum in Oklahoma City, I believe, along with the model of Heroine that was made at Texas A&M University. If not, I can get the answer pretty quickly and put it up on the chat.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more quick question. Someone is asking, do we know how fast the Phoenix might have traveled?
Yeah, roughly, like, there are some different answers to that, but about 8 miles per hour, maybe a little bit faster than that. I think, there were 2 different steam engines on Phoenix, and it's possible that the more advanced ones, what they used to do is they would reuse steam engines multiple times. And so these steamboat companies would have multiple steamboats. And if one wrecked, they would actually salvage the machinery and pull it up and then just stick it on another vessel. And they would do that over and over and over again until they basically fell apart in many cases. And so when Phoenix got an overhaul, it had a much more efficient engine, and maybe it could go a little bit faster than that. But typically they still weren't going all that fast.
All right, awesome. We're going to circle back to as many questions that haven't gotten answered yet at the end as we're able to. So if you guys have any more, you can feel free to keep them coming. But thank you, George.
Excellent work, George. Thank you very much. The discovery of these paddle wheels has been one of the most exciting things that I've been involved with at the Maritime Museum in the last couple of decades. And, I think you've done a great job in pointing out just how important they are and how interesting they are and how much more we still have to learn about them. So I'm really excited to continue that operation. But now for the conference, we're going to transition back towards discussions that are focused on the recent work by the Maritime Museum in Arnold's Bay and the Revolutionary War battlefield there in Arnold's Bay. So I'm going to pass things over to the Assistant Director of Archaeology at the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, Sherilyn Gilligan, to talk about our underwater research and our recent findings in Arnold's Bay.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in with us today. The next 3 presentations will cover more focused topics within the ongoing Arnold's Bay research project. In 2020, the museum was awarded a National Park Service American Battlefield Protection Program grant to survey the American Revolutionary Battlefield in Arnold's Bay, located in Panton, Vermont. The overall project is being carried out in collaboration with the Stockbridge-Munsee community and Abenaki leaders, and the museum also partnered with the Advanced Metal Detecting for the Archaeologist Group for a 2021 terrestrial course in metal detection along the shoreline and the farm fields that border the bay. We owe a special thanks to the private landowners and their livestock who have aided and supported this project and allowed us to access their property. Thank you again to the Hopper family. Today, I'll be focusing on the in-water work that took place in the summer and fall of 2022. I will reorient you to the site and the specific event that took place here, and I'll explain a bit about our methodology using underwater transects and underwater metal detection. And then I want to talk about some of the new material culture that we encountered, along with the underwater finds from the previous field season. And I'll discuss what the locations of these objects may be able to tell us about the events that took place here during the battle. The action that took place in Arnold's Bay, formerly Ferris Bay, marked the end of the running battle up Lake Champlain following the Battle of Valcour Bay, which had caused the loss of American vessels Royal Savage, Philadelphia, New Jersey, and Spitfire. On October 11, 1776, General Benedict Arnold, with a fleet of 15 vessels and some bateaux, and maybe 500 men aboard this fleet with little to no sailing experience, spotted the British fleet around 8 a.m. from their position between Valcour Island and the New York shore. You can see that location on the left side of this map. A lot of the American soldiers were barely soldiers at all. Many were volunteer farmers and men from many different backgrounds and cultures that supported the American cause for revolution. The British fleet sailed south past Valcour Island and then was forced to turn upwind to face the American line, meaning they had to turn and sail upwind in order to form their own line from the southern end of the island to the New York shoreline and engage their enemy. A handful of primary sources we have about this event describe the British fleet to have had 20 to 28 armed gunboats to the Americans' 15, as well as a greater number of accompanying bateaux, filled with trained and experienced Royal Navy officers. Their fleet included a troop of Hessian soldiers, as well as allied indigenous warriors and Canadians who joined the battle from the New York shore as well as the shores of Valcour Island. The American fleet was well outnumbered, although some of the largest boats of the British fleet did not engage in the conflict at all, which definitely involves some British scandal. On the left of the screen is an excerpt from a letter from Longcroft, Shank, and Stark to their captain Pringle about his actions, well, really his inactions of the day of the battle. But by the end of the day on the 11th, the American side was in pretty rough shape. Most of their cannon fire that day missed their targets or went over, which, according to primary sources, was due to British gunboats being low in the water. Royal Savage had crashed at the start of the battle and burned on the end of Valcour Island, with some of the American crew captured by the British. You can see to the right here a painting by Ernie Haas of Royal Savage burning where it crashed at the end of Valcour Island. And I'll be showing quite a few paintings by Ernie Haas today because his works are really incredible and historically accurate depictions of a lot of the events that I will be covering today. During the action of the 11th, the American row galleys Congress, Trumbull, and Washington had their hulls punctured repeatedly and took damage to their main masts, and Philadelphia sunk at the end of the day from the damage it sustained. This is another painting by Ernie Haas with the title description, "The Philadelphia Sinking, Assisted by the Galley Washington, Battle of Valcour Island, Lake Champlain, October 11, 1776. And that's the gunboat Philadelphia in the foreground and the larger row galley Washington behind it assisting. A reported 60 men from the American side were killed or wounded at Valcour, and the Americans had gone through 3/4 of their ammunition. That night, what was left of the damaged American fleet was able to slip out of the bay to the south and through the British line in the dark of night, with the aid of fog and the distraction of the burning Royal Savage. The fleet continued through the night 7.5 miles to the south to Schuyler Island. Some boats stopped briefly and continued on south towards Fort Ticonderoga, but others, including Congress and Washington, needed to fix sails and leaks and took extra time. The gunboat New Jersey was partially scuttled at Schuyler Island, and the gunboat Spitfire was sunk in deep water after the bulk of the fleet began moving south once more. By the evening of the 12th, the British were back in pursuit, while the Americans struggled to row their battered fleet through the night. In the early morning of the 13th, with the help of a northern wind, the superior British vessels Inflexible, Carleton, and Maria caught up alongside the rough and damaged American fleet and engaged them once again. The image to the left shows this action from the running battle, and it gives a really great perspective to just how much larger and superior the British Royal Navy vessels were compared to the tiny American row galleys you can make out in between them. The row galley Washington was overwhelmed quickly and struck, and its crew and captain were captured. And the running battle began at Split Rock, which, if you look to the map on the right, is located on the New York side right after the K in the New York label. You can see that tiny notch, that's Split Rock. So the British caught up to the American fleet there and continued over 9 miles south to where the row galley Congress, along with the smaller gunboats Boston, Connecticut, New Haven, and Providence, were run into this shallow bay, known as Ferris Bay, which is located in present-day Panton, Vermont, and is now known as Arnold's Bay. And then again, at the right, this map shows where the action started at Valcour Bay, which is that red star on the top left, and where it ended at Arnold's Bay, the star to the bottom right. Here you can see another Ernie Haas painting, and I'm sorry for the poor quality on this one because it is a really interesting scene. But this painting is showing Congress under attack at the mouth of Arnold's Bay, with the gunboats further ahead of the row galley. And that is the British ship Inflexible in the foreground firing at those boats. And this is a really great image because it gives you the feeling of the chase. And you can see the holes in the sails of the vessel in the foreground, the cannon fire splashing all around Congress as it heads into the mouth of the bay, and the steep bluff at the back of Arnold's Bay too. And there's some really great details in this one, even though it's a black and white copy of the image, so I wanted to include that here. And then here you can see a much better quality image of the same scene, also by Ernie Haas, and this from a slightly different perspective and point in the battle. So you can see the American boats beached and on fire at this point, and these larger British vessels are Carleton and Maria. And at this point, we have General Arnold already ordered these vessels to be burned with their flags flying, right where they were run aground. The men were ordered overboard to shore to set up a line of defense against the British, who continued to fire on them from outside the mouth of the bay. And the British boats, again, were so much larger, and this bay is maybe 15 feet at the deepest part of the mouth, and it quickly gets quite shallow. So the British boats couldn't get in very close. And after some back and forth between the two sides, Arnold and his remaining men, along with the Ferris family from the homestead on the bay, fled on foot towards Crown Point and Fort Ticonderoga. So now that we are familiar with the storyline of events here, I wanted to go over the goals of this research project. We mainly wanted to produce some site boundary and feature data in order to modernize our understanding of this last battle of 1776, and also figure out physically how large this site actually is. We have a handful of primary documents that are perspectives from diary entries from American soldiers and British soldiers who lived through the event, and letters as well. We have contemporary summaries of the event from folks who were not there and from folks writing details about the event well after it was over. And collectively, these accounts mention an American line of defense was ordered. We know that at some point after the battle, British soldiers came through and called this place Destruction Bay because of the carnage that took place there. And the British soldiers took the time to bury the remains that they found there. We have accounts that the British fired at the homestead a few times and that they killed all of the livestock and burned the buildings. So we've collected all of these data that tell us about what happened on the site. And so another part of our work is determining how these accounts measure up against the archaeological data that we're generating. And I guess more specifically, we hope to archaeologically delineate areas where the 4 gunboats, Boston, Connecticut, New Haven, and Providence, may have been initially beached and burned. And also we hope to investigate a little more about the post-depositional removal of these 4 gunboats throughout the following years. The last gunboat was removed in the 1950s, and we actually have some photographs of that event in the museum's collections. And you can see this image on the right here is one of those photographs where you can see the big cans that they used to float the boat and some of its structure in the foreground, and then the lines from a crane that was on a barge platform. So now I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the in situ portion of the Rogue Alley Congress, which is the only known articulated remains of a vessel still located on the site. And I'm not going into that because Chris Sabick's upcoming presentation will cover that in detail. But I will be talking a bit more about some of our theories about how the historical removal of a portion of Congress may have impacted the rest of the site during the late 1800s when it was partially removed. Okay, so a bit about our methodology. As I mentioned, we did do in-water work the previous field season in 2021 that was somewhat limited. Once we relocated the known remains of Congress, we chose to set up transects to the north and south of that landmark. And we set these transects to run north to south. And then we used underwater metal detectors to investigate to the east and west sides of those lines, about 3 feet to each side of the transect lines. And now I want to mention here that metal detection in an archaeological setting is not always the best tool for every job. In this specific case, in order to answer our research questions, metal detection turned out to be a great tool to be able to see the ammunition scatter across the site, which can help determine site boundaries, as well as feature data for the site. So we were able to use this survey technique across the surrounding farm fields, the transitional shoreline area, and then into and under the water. And so if folks are interested in learning more about the use of metal detection in archaeological work, please check out the Advanced Metal Detecting for the Archaeologist group, or AMDA. They are a group of professionals who teach courses that are RPA certified, that's registered for professional archaeologists. And they have some great case studies out there that are just wonderful examples of how to really use the tool of metal detection for archaeological investigation. So do check them out. And all of their instructors are just fantastic. So again, at this point in 2021, we still didn't have our permit in hand from the Naval Heritage and History Command to be able to access the remains of Congress. which belonged to the US Navy. So we had applied for an archaeological permit to explore that wreck, and since we didn't yet have permission to do that in 2021, we worked around where we knew the articulated remains were, and instead investigated the debris field to the northwest and to the southeast of the Congress remains. Now, this map shows the transects that we covered in 2022 off to the right, which we were able to cover with the help of 2 volunteers, Craig Allen and Ed Scollin, who we will hear from shortly. And also we had 2 interns over the summer, Ian Shoemaker and Chelsea Cohen, who were able to train in underwater archaeological metal detection. And then Chris and myself. And I think we got another of our team out, Patricia, for a little bit at least. So you can see some of our field crew photos of us to the left. And we were able to investigate a much greater area around the in situ remains of Congress with our larger crew this season. And while we waited for our Navy permit to come through, we extended certain transects, tested some areas closer inshore and then away from shore. And in classic archaeological fashion, we ended up with a bunch more questions than we had started with, and an overall understanding that this site is so much larger than we initially expected to find, which is always a bit exciting and daunting at once. The map on your right is a little crazy, I know, but this is showing all of the archaeologically recovered material from the underwater portion of the survey. We finished out the dive season with 878 cataloged artifacts in this collection, but the data set that we will be working with today is 663 objects. And the reason for this is to be able to present the positively identified material that is part of the battlefield site. So basically, I've pulled out all of the modern debris, which you can imagine there would be a lot of intrusions to the site over the last 250 years in the bay. But I also pulled out pieces that are currently unidentified. So as we're conserving more artifacts in the collection and continuing our research, these numbers will change around some. And as a problematic example that I pulled from the data set that we'll see today, I have an image here of some unidentified tin iron. We have flagged this as potentially being remnants of a canister, which would have held iron case shot and then been shot out of a cannon. And in the full assemblage, we have over 70 objects marked as the same potential bits of canisters. So I've left this out of our data set of 663 because it would confuse the data on ammunition if one of the largest categories was actually currently unidentified. So I hope that makes a bit of sense moving forward. All right, so this is my really cool chart. On the left side, we're seeing a breakdown of our total of 663 objects, and those are broken down into some easy categories. The majority of our objects are ammunitions, so we have 405 objects in that category. This is followed by fasteners, think nails and the like. We have 210 fasteners. We have 13 objects categorized as animal and 13 categorized as apparel. And then we have 6 armaments. And we have an other category with 16 objects. So our largest section, which is ammunition, is the section of the pie chart that's broken down there in the smaller pie chart to the right. And in that right pie chart, you can quickly see the majority of that ammunition is made up of musket balls. So that's 332 musket balls, followed by 53 iron shot, or case shot rather, and 12 cannonballs. And I've also thrown melted lead into this section, and that's 8 pieces. So I've thrown these in here because if you can imagine 5 boats were burned in this bay, it's quite likely that those fires melted some of those musket balls and reformed into some of the weird blobs of melted lead that we were finding across the site. In this slide, we're seeing that pie chart break down our 405 ammunition pieces once again. And to the right, we're seeing the scatter of these musket balls across the site. So this is an interesting thing about the spread. There's a very heavy cluster to the north end of Transect 5, and that's right up there at the top right. And then the absence of material not far away from the north end of Transect 6, which is just to the left of that cluster. And if you follow Transect 6 all the way to the south end, we see another absence of material there. And I'll also mention here that the other features shown on this map, besides the location of Congress, which is in yellow, are the ballast piles. And we were able to map those in over this season as well. So that is the green circle to the left of Congress and that longer oval shape that's orange to the north. And that pile was moved from the ship remains during some excavations that happened in the 1960s. And then the last thing here are the range of sizes of these musket balls that you can see here on the page as well. Here we have our same ammunition chart, but the map is now showing the scatter of cannonballs and case shot across the site. So the lighter blue pins on transect 1 to the north, and which is the one that's all the way to the left, those are cannonballs. And you can see they're kind of clustered around the stern ballast pile, which is that green circle on the left. And you can see a few more of the cannonballs to the north of transects 4 and 6. Those are the middle 2 transects. And the rest are our case shot. And although there's fewer objects in this category, the blank spaces overlap with those in the musket ball category. And again, you can see the size difference here between the 2 right case shot examples and that larger cannonball on the left. Now we are looking at the melted pieces of lead. And these are kind of all central to the total area that we investigated. They're sort of clustered to the southeast of the Congress remains. And which, if we remember back to the last 2 scatters, is just before the material starts to thin out to the south of those 2 transects. And that first example of melted lead, which is starting on the left-hand side, is probably the most interesting of the melted lead pieces that we've recovered, because it looks as though the lead melted and then cooled in between the floorboards of one of these boats. And you can see that raised portion in the center that's running left to right. And then the far right, this is a musket ball example that it looks like it got hot enough to begin to get soft but didn't fully liquefy next to other musket balls. So it has these indents all around it on its surface. And there were several pieces that looked this way in the collection. And then in the center, we have another sort of melted chunk of lead in there. All right, now we're looking at our fasteners, our second largest group here, which was totaling 210 pieces. On the right, you can see these are broken into just 3 categories. We have 136 nails, 73 spikes, and then 1 staple. Nails and spikes for this study are differentiated by length, so any fastener that measured over 4 inches long was classified as a spike. And so we're seeing a majority of those smaller nails making up this collection. And many of the nails and spikes have diagnostic features like rose heads. And these are all hand wrought. Now we can see our map to the right showing the scatter of these objects across the site. The map is not yet distinguishing between nails and spikes, as we've only just recently finished taking all of the pre-conservation measurements for the objects. But moving forward, we will be looking at that to see if we can distinguish any patterns. So, for instance, these different sized nails would have been used in different parts of a ship's construction. So that locational data in the size difference could show a scatter from different parts of these boats. And also, I'll point out again that that negative data in the same areas, that southern end of transect 3 there, that's more central and just east of where that very large cluster of musket balls were located at the top right corner. Moving on to the apparel category, out of 13 total objects, there's a majority of 7 buttons, followed by 5 buckles, and finally a single eyepiece from a hook and eye closure. Some of the buttons here were fragments. These were all simple cupreous buttons with no decoration. And for the buckles, we have 2 of those as just fragments of a buckle. We had 2 examples of knee buckles and also a single shoe buckle. At the top left, you can see a nice example of that shoe buckle, followed by a knee buckle. And then that last photograph is a good example of what the majority of those buttons are like. And in the map to the right, we're seeing the scatter of apparel elements across the site. And again, these are not in any of the negative data zones pointed out earlier. That bright yellow point just south of Congress is where the shoe buckle was found. The rest of the iron buckles are the red points. And then if you look closely at the yellow outline of the remains of Congress, you can see a stripe that's running north to south. And that is the location of the trench that was excavated during the last week of fieldwork in 2022. And what Chris Sabik will be talking about in more detail. But I wanted to mention that we are looking at the dredge data from Congress in these figures as well. So actually all of the buttons that are in the assemblage were found in this trench, as was the very tiny eye from the hook and eye closure. So these items from the trench are still being processed, so I don't have more than a field photo for some of these pieces just yet. All right, here we are looking at the breakdown of armaments from our right-hand pie chart. So we had 6 pieces total here that break down into 2 examples of bayonets that were found, 2 flint wraps, a single honey-colored flint, and a single fragment of a ramrod from a musket. And here's our scatter of these pieces across our site. The bayonet examples are the bright red points on the map. You can see the first top left image. There's that a bayonet that was fitted as a pike. So there's a wooden piece extended off to the left of that image there. And then to the right of that, you can see this piece being compared to another bayonet from the museum's collections. So it's interesting to see that it's been sort of bent forward a bit, but it's quite similar. And then the second example is in the upper right corner. Our two flint wraps are the yellow points on the map. You can see the one on the top right is also where that large musket ball concentration was located. And the second one is over to the left from there along transect 4. And a flint wrap example can be seen on the lower left of the screen. And then our ramrod fragment that was found all the way down on the south end of transect 5. And that's a yellow pin that's like right down there at the bottom of the map. And this is one of the locations where the material culture is really starting to drop off. So again, that's a pretty interesting find all the way down there. And then finally, our flint example, a piece that's not metal, was found once again in the Congress Trench. And we'll see several more examples of items in the last two categories that were located from the dredging that would not have been located with just a metal detector. So keep that in mind that those items are associated with Congress. In our category marked Other, we're looking at 9 pieces of glass. Some of those are the green glass associated with wine bottles for this time period. Under the kitchen category, we found 2 spoons and a fork, as well as a kettle fragment and a cork stopper. And then we found an example of a hinge and also an inkwell. All right, so the fork was found at the north end of T6, which is one of the central transects that is marked with a red pin. And then on the left, you can see a field photo of that fork bagged up. To the right of that object and clustered to the north end of transect 5 in the sort of top right corner of the map are our kettle fragment in red and our inkwell and hinge examples in yellow. And you can see the inkwell image up there in my hand. And to the right of that, the hinge we found. And then to give you an idea of what that could represent, there's an image of a folding ruler next to that, so you can sort of picture what this object might have been. And those 2 pieces were also found in the big musket ball cluster on the north end of transect 5. And then our glass pieces and the cork stopper, those were found within the Congress Trench. And finally, our 2 spoons. So one example you can see just to the right of the graph at the bottom of the slide. And that piece is at the south end of transect 1. So that transect is all the way to the left on the map. So they are kind of right next to each other. And that pin is yellow. And finally, the last yellow pin on the south and sort of one of the central transects was where the engraved spoon handle was that we found, which I'm going to show you in the next slide right here. So you can see that engraving up close. It's engraved with the initials AP. And so this is just such a cool piece because it's such a personalized object. And this was a really great find that helps to remind you that we're investigating the people that participated in this brutal battle. And they carried with them things like eating utensils. And they lost their buckles and their buttons off their clothes, and sometimes their gear broke. So personal finds like this are always a powerful reminder of the people who took part in the events that we're investigating in the field. And here we are at our last category, which is animals. So 12 out of 13 of these objects were found in the Congress Trench. Occasionally you will find associated materials that are not metal during a metal detecting survey, but when you're using a dredge, you're going to get everything it catches. So the majority of these pieces are very small. All 4 objects marked pig are teeth. There are 2 marked deer. One is a tooth and the other is a metacarpal, which is a larger piece, and that is the one object in this category that was not in the trench. So this actually could be an intrusion. And then there are 7 unidentified pieces, some of which I think we can further identify later on. Look at that last map again. Most pieces were found in the Congress Trench, so inside that yellow box. And then the outlier was just to the north of the ballast pile that's just north of Congress. So on transect 4, right above that orange box. And you can see an image of that outlier bone as well on this page. And then again, we don't have images of everything that's come from the trench just yet. So what does it all mean, and what did we figure out through all of this? It's a great question, and we are still processing data, so some of what I've shown you today will change. But building a little bit on some theories from last year's data, along with the much larger data set that we produced this past field season, plus add in our research that we've done with primary documentation, we're leaning closer towards the location of where we think the last gunboat was removed. And you can see that red outline in the map on the right here of where we think that may be. And it's just a bit south of Congress. So some of the reasoning has to do with the cluster of personal apparel and armament surrounding this area. But I would also cite the negative data that's just to the south of that location, where shot and personal apparel would have tapered off. Especially if you imagine the scene pictured on the left, where these men are jumping overboard with what arms they could take, and they're heading straight east to get to land and cover while they're being continually bombarded by the British. So the archaeological data, along with the photographs documenting the removal of that last gunboat in 1952, makes this area a really good candidate for the location of that 1952 gunboat. I'll cover one more theory here before I pass this off to Ed Scollin and Chris Sabick, since they're both going to share some more of our findings. And so we were all intrigued by this really dense cloud of musket balls, which was, again, to the northeast on the map, all the way to the right. So this was at the north end of Transect 5, and it's not just musket balls, right? In there we saw all kinds of objects from our different artifact categories, which kind of helps us lead towards the idea that it could have something to do with the attempted removal of Congress in the 1890s. And without talking too much about the boat itself, we're wondering if this cloud is indicative of one half of the boat being dragged out to the shoreline and sort of dumping this mass of material here on its way out, as it was kind of jerked out at an incline or snagged or more pieces broke off. And again, we're looking at historic photos to help out our theories here. So you can see on the left the image of a portion of Congress that was pulled out on shore here in the bay. And we're also looking at those smaller finds and things like the inkwell and the tool hinge that would have found themselves at home in a boat's cabin. So those are just a few of our leanings as we continue to crunch our data here. And I'll let the others cue you in on what we're looking forward to this coming season in 2023. So thanks very much for turning out for our conference. And I hope you enjoy the next two presentations on further Arnold's Bay project topics. And I'm happy to field a few questions before we move on to the next paper. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that, Shara. That was great. We've got a couple of questions before we move on. So
yeah, I saw a couple come through and I wasn't able to get to them right away. Mike Barbieri brought up a really good point, and I was wondering if I could share a screen real quick, because I didn't get a chance to talk at all about the terrestrial portion of the survey. So I, especially because that was a big focus of last year's presentation, which I encourage people to go check out. So let me see if I can figure out how to do this.
yeah, that would be great.
Let's see. All right, can we see that? I don't care if you can see the rest of the slide deck or whatever, but you see the overhead?
Yep, we see it.
All right, cool. So the pink boxes on the outside farm field area are the zones that we ended up testing during the AMDA survey in 2021. And then that yellow shoreline area was also a zone that we tested. So I just wanted folks to be aware that like that has also been taken into account with a lot of the, the rest of this project. Because I don't think I actually covered that. But Mike, more to your question, right now there's no plans to go back and cover more area there. Obviously, we all really wanted to keep going with that. But I mean, this is such a huge site, as I said, and we're still learning just how much this extends. So, always hope to do more research. So I guess we shall see. It's kind of an open-ended one. Let's see, I guess I can stop sharing this now. What were some other ones? Let me try to, I I don't know if I'm skipping any, but have you tested unidentified pieces to be human? So the animal bones that we found it's mostly teeth. And honestly, I haven't had time to to compare them further than just knowing that they're animal teeth. So no, we're not finding human remains. Am I missing any others to Sarah?
Someone is asking, has the shoreline lake level changed much since 1776?
An awesome question, and one that we've been asking a lot too. Chris, Ed, I haven't seen any evidence that or like actual studies on this per se, but it doesn't seem like it's changed much. Do either of you care to speak to that?
And from my understanding, the lake level, it's a natural lake. The outlet of the lake has not changed. It hasn't been dammed significantly enough to change the level. So I believe the lake level is the same or similar. The level of the lake fluctuates considerably over the course of a regular year, from a low of about 95 feet above sea level up to flood stage, which I think is 101 feet above lake level. So it does, unlike some other lakes in this area, it does fluctuate quite a bit, but I don't think over the historic period it has changed beyond that range of fluctuation that we see annually. What we did see significant changes on is the shoreline of Arnold's Bay itself. Appears to have eroded significantly since over the last 250 years. So that is certainly part of the environment that is hard to quantify how much change has taken place since 1776.
Interesting. We have another quick question. Someone is asking about how old the items that you found are. Is there like a range of ages, or are they all about the same?
Well, I mean, I guess the way I would answer that is, especially in terms of the data set that I was showing, those pieces, those 663, those are time period. So those are associated with this site, as far as we can tell. And other pieces that aren't maybe not modern, but maybe a little further out, I've pulled those out too. So yes, we are seeing that within the collection. I mean, a lot of activity in this bay since the time of deposition and the time of that event. There was a ferry service in and out of there, and it's been, this has been a homestead there and on and on. So it's, yeah, a lot of intrusions in the site for sure.
Awesome, thanks. Well, I think we can get to the next presentation, and for everyone in the chat whose questions have not yet been answered, we are going to try to circle back to them during the big Q&A at the very end, where we can kind of devote some more time to answering them. So thank you so much for all your good questions so far.
Yeah, lots of great stuff. And I see there's some Spitfire questions in there to answer at the end as well. And I'm happy to do that when we get to the bigger Q&A. But for now, we're going to transition to Ed Scullin and his presentation about the use of howitzers during these Revolutionary War conflicts and evidence that we found of them both at Arnold's Bay and at the Valcour Bay battlefield as well. Take it away, Ed. Thanks.
Thank you. I've got a video that's ready to go. And get that set. Hello, my name is Ed Scullin. I'm a research associate with the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. Today I'll be presenting howitzers and their role in the Revolutionary War on Lake Champlain. Archaeological research unveils a key new detail in Arnold's Bay. Interpreting the 1776 Battle of Lake Champlain has been a focus of the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum since its inception. The museum is located in the town of Ferrisburg, Vermont, 2 miles from what is now known as Arnold's Bay. The battle actually began much further north, in a strait bordered by the New York shoreline and Valcour Island. It was there, in 1999, that the Maritime Museum partnered with a team of volunteer avocational archaeologists to form the Valcour Bay Research Project. They focused their efforts on what had been the American line of battle and meticulously examined nearly 7 acres of those submerged lands. Over 8 consecutive years of survey, they located scores of battle-related artifacts, from cannon to cartridge box, and significantly contributed to the understanding of that crucial first day of engagement. 2 extensive reports were produced to interpret their findings. Remnants of the three-day battle have been strewn over the 35 miles of lake bed and shoreline that lie between Valcour Bay and Arnold's Bay. Likewise, contemporary accounts of the 1776 northern campaigns were dispersed among private and public collections throughout the United States, Canada, and United Kingdom. Over the course of the 1999 Valcour Bay Research Project, collaborations between archaeologists and archival researchers had successfully paired a number of archaeological discoveries with the battle's written record. With those successes in mind, and that experience in hand, museum researchers set out to gather accounts pertinent to Arnold's final escape. Those records could prove useful interpreting the historical context of any material remains encountered there, just as they had at Valcour Bay. Located so close to the Maritime Museum, similar work had long been considered at Arnold's Bay. The museum was awarded an American Battlefield Protection Program Battlefield Preservation Planning Grant through the National Park Service in the spring of 2020. The project included collaboration with the Stockbridge-Muncie Band of Mohicans and a partnership with the Advanced Metal Detecting for the Archaeologists Group. In October of 2021, the museum hosted a 3-day instructional seminar conducted by the AMDA. Upwards of 200 men had escaped overland with Arnold following the destruction of their vessels. Students searched for evidence of that retreat while honing their metal detection skills alongside Maritime Museum and AMDA archaeologists. Additionally, the museum prepared for a 2022 survey to identify any remains of the Rogue Galley Congress. Of the 5 American vessels, only its wreckage is thought to remain within the bay. The land surrounding the bay is privately owned, and the owners had generously offered their permission and assistance for the surveys. Archaeological permits have been secured from the state of Vermont, as well as the U.S. Navy, via the Naval Heritage and History Command. The most obvious differences between Valcour Bay and Arnold's Bay are those of scale. Valcour Bay is 3/4 of a mile wide and reaches depths of over 60 feet. Arnold's Bay is less than 900 feet across, and its deepest depths are a mere 14 feet at its mouth. The first day of engagement at Valcour Bay lasted nearly an entire day. Any engagement taking place by Arnold scuttled ships was of much shorter duration and involved considerably fewer vessels from either side. At Valcour Bay, relic hunting didn't reach a significant scale until the advent of scuba. Because of the ease of access to its shores and shallows, Arnold's Bay has been subjected to countless searches since Arnold's ships had come to rest there. The biggest question facing the project's archaeologists was the degree to which relic hunting had impacted the site. Would the teams encounter much for archaeological evidence in Arnold's Bay, or had the fleet's remains been completely scavenged and scattered? Would the archaeologists have any hope of interpreting that 1776 event from the artifacts that did remain? Since relic hunting at Arnold's Bay was known to be somewhat of a 19th century pastime, newspaper repositories were where the museum researchers chose to look first. The era's local periodicals may provide valuable insights in assessing what had been previously collected, what the surveyors may potentially encounter, and where to best direct their efforts. The researchers located dozens of articles regarding the retrieval of artifacts from the bay and its shores, by both local citizens and those traveling to the area for that specific purpose. What piqued their interest most was an 1860s article that mentioned a brass howitzer being taken out of a vessel Arnold sank in Lake Champlain in time of the Revolutionary War, that occurring some 50 years before. Another from an 1880s reported the recovery of a shell fragment from the southern shore of the bay. The Valcour Bay Research Project surveys had archaeologically verified the use of British howitzers at Valcour. The British had documented their use of howitzers upon a few of their gunboats and their massive radeaux. In between our successive surveys, Justin Clement, Pottsgrove Manor's historic site supervisor, then a Maritime Museum intern, would assemble and interpret that data and greatly contribute to our understanding of the distribution of the British artillery amongst their vessels. That work contributed to Douglas R. Covinson's "The Artillery Never Gained More Honor, the British Artillery in the 1776 Valcour Island and 1777 Saratoga Campaigns." For students of the Northern campaigns, this treatise is a must-read. Carrying the names of Thunderer, Blast, Carcass, Firebrand, and Tartar, one would suspect their armament was determined before the vessels were christened. Despite our understanding of the British armament, the American deployment of a howitzer was new news. The only known contemporary return of the American fleet that museum researchers are aware of didn't list howitzers upon its inventory of the fleet's guns. The only guns listed were cannon and swivel guns. The American deployment of a howitzer was a fact that apparently had not been recorded and lost to history. The 1880s report of a shell fragment being discovered at Arnold's Bay was puzzling too. Of the British ships that had managed to catch up to the retreating Americans, none had been recorded as carrying howitzers. Captain Charles Douglas reported to his superiors in Britain. The ship Inflexible with the Maria and Carleton schooners did the whole of the second day's business. The Rideau, called the Thunderer, and the gondola called the Loyal Convert, with the gunboats, not having been able to keep up with them. The Vermonter and the Rutland Herald articles prompted more questions than they provided answers. Could a howitzer have actually been retrieved from the bay? Could it have been deployed aboard a ship of the American fleet, but not recorded in the contemporary return? From where could the recovered shell fragment have originated? Could that fragment be a remnant of American munitions? For answers, museum researchers next turned to the 1776 dispatches between General Arnold and his superior, Major General Horatio Gates. It's the summer of 1776, and General Gates commands the Northern Army from Ticonderoga, under the direction of Major General Philip Schuyler. In early August, Arnold is given command of the growing American squadron upon Lake Champlain. Gates outlines a set of directives for Arnold, but completely leaves the management of maritime affairs to his subordinate upon the lake. Dispatches are frequently exchanged between them as ships, supplies, and personnel are sent to augment the fleet. Arnold follows a list of Gates' directives to the letter. He continually advises Gates and Schuyler regarding issues of supply, intelligence, personnel, and any contact with enemy detachments. He explains his current and prospective anchorages and proposes deployment strategies should the British attempt a concerted advance up the lake. Those anchorages change and his strategies evolve as the campaign season progresses and the arms race intensifies. Arnold makes a request for howitzers as early as September 8th. Howitzers are essentially a cross between a cannon and a mortar. They resemble cannons in that their pivots, called trunnions, are mounted midway along their sides. That feature allows the howitzers to be mounted on carriages for better maneuverability. They resemble mortars in that their primary projectiles are explosive shells. Being of much shorter length than cannon, howitzers can pivot much further upon their trunnions and offer a far greater range of elevation. The trajectory of their shells can be linear, like cannon, or set to a higher arc, like mortars. In that first week of September, Arnold has his fleet cruising the northern and narrow extremities of the lake. His primary directive is to prevent the movement of the British forces out of Canada, but he is to remain on the defensive and make no wanton risk or unnecessary display of the power of the fleet. It is also Gates's positive order that he does not command the fleet to sail north of Ash Island. His intelligence reports of British shipbuilding at St. John's, 20 miles further north, are incomplete and inaccurate. His spies and informants observe mostly large numbers of troops in tow. When guardboat crews report hearing trees being felled in the nearby woods, Arnold suspects that batteries are being built to mount a shore-based attack. If the batteries are used in concert with a large contingent of enemy bateaux, Arnold is concerned that his gondolas, with their low gunnels, are vulnerable to being overwhelmed, boarded, and captured. To mitigate that vulnerability, Arnold orders that fascine be cut and rigged above their gunnels. The tightly bundled saplings will prevent the enemy from boarding those vessels and also protect their crews from small shot. The howitzers will offer the best solution in dealing with the batteries. The high trajectory and explosive power of their shells will be most effective against the batteries and the men behind them. As 18th century artillerist John Muller explained, their use is to throw hollow balls filled with powder called shells, which falling upon any building or into the works of a fortification burst and their fragments destroy everything in reach. The terror they would cause, especially amongst the horse, by rolling amongst the ranks with the fuse burning and the expectation of their bursting every moment, would disorder the bravest men, by means whereof they might easily be broke, and the day thereby won. As with many desperately needed items to supply and complement the fleet, it appears that the requested howitzers are expected, but have yet to arrive at Ticonderoga. Gates and Major General Philip Schuyler have been doing everything within their power to equip Arnold's armada, but with Washington's army confronting British forces at Long Island and New York, American supply is stretched beyond its limits. Gates will later complain to Congressional President John Hancock, "There is not a single howitzer or mortar of any kind upon this ground." On the 18th of September, Arnold finally receives intelligence that he trusts is accurate, and the news is alarming. Lieutenant Benjamin Whitcomb returns from a scout with 2 British Army prisoners in tow. It is confirmed that the British shipbuilding at St. John's is far more advanced and formidable than the Americans had anticipated. What's most concerning is that their fleet includes a ship designed to mount 20 guns. The ship has been under construction at Quebec for service upon the St. Lawrence. It was reassigned to Lake Champlain, disassembled, and then sent above the rapids of the Richelieu. It is now on the stocks and within 2 weeks of its completion as HMS Inflexible. Worse yet is the news that Royal Navy officers, sailors, and gunners have followed the ship. They will supplement the fleet under the command of Major General Guy Carleton, the governor of Quebec. Arnold now knows he will be confronted by greater ships, greater guns, and men that are far better trained and experienced in manning them. His mind assesses the gravity of the challenges before him, mulls over his fleet's current shortfalls, and formulates new strategies of defense. He finds his flotilla distressingly deficient in the metal of its munitions and in the metal of his men. In his short military career, Arnold knows all too well that it's upon the weight of both which battles are most often won. In what would become one of Arnold's most cited dispatches, complaining that few of his seamen were ever wet with salt water, and that his Marines were the refuse of every regiment, he pleads, "I beg at least 100 good seamen be sent to me as soon as possible." He plans to move the fleet to Valcour, where 'tis good harbor, and we shall have the advantage over the enemy. He renews his request for howitzers and outlines his intentions for their use. "I could wish to have a 6 or 8-inch howitzer mounted in 2 or 3 of the galleys. If they are arrived, they will be infinitely more service than guns, especially to attack a large vessel." Contrary to what Gates would later report to Hancock, Arnold writes at its close, "There is a small brass royal at Ty, which with 100 shells and a gunner may be very useful to us." A royal is a howitzer or a mortar designed to fire a 5.5-inch shell. Uncovered, most were found to be completely intact. The shells apparently missed their targets and struck the water before their fuses could ignite their charges. However, a significant number of shell fragments were also discovered. It appears that from their relatively stable anchorages, and over the course of that initial day-long battle, the British gunners had successfully adjusted the trajectory of their shells and the timing of their fuses. Two veterans of the Washington galley would later recount their brushes with the British bombs. Upon his return home, William Briggs would report, "A bomb catch did great damage to our vessels, many of the shells being thrown on board with great exactness." In a pension application affidavit, Elijah Towner would recall the devastation caused by all manner of shot, including the shells, the galley being much cut to pieces and many killed and wounded. In the first battle on Friday, Lieutenant Fairweather was killed by a double-headed shot, and the same shot also killed a seaman by the name of Taylor. Captain Thatcher was badly wounded in his legs in the same battle by a shell. A well-placed shell had the potential to do far more than break the bodies and the resolve of a ship's captain and crew. It could set rigging and sails afire, potentially detonate onboard magazines, and severely undermine the ship's hull. With ships as large as the Inflexible and the Thunderer, both over 80 feet in length, the odds of placing a shell upon their decks was considerably better. If Arnold could affect the seaworthiness of either vessel, it just may turn the tide of the contest. It was certainly a chance worth taking, and Arnold settled on the only howitzer within his reach. Arnold got the royal that he requested, as a receipt completed at Fort Ticonderoga's laboratory shows. The receipt would include 1 brass royal and 28 shells, 28 fuses, for the use of the fleet on Lake Champlain, received by order of Brigadier General Arnold. On October 2nd, both the Washington and the Congress galleys would set sail from Ticonderoga to join the fleet at Valcour, the same day that this receipt was completed. Just 11 days later, the Washington and the 110 men that the galley carried would become prize and prisoners of war. Moments after her sister ship's capture, Arnold's flagship would be destroyed in a thundering spectacle of defiance. In between the Valcour Bay and Arnold's Bay engagements, Arnold would write to Gates, "We suffered much for want of seamen and gunners. I was obliged myself to point most of the guns on board the Congress, which I believed a good execution. Whether the Royal may have been one of those guns remains unclear. It was the concealment of the island. Without any doubt, if any of the original 28 howitzer shells had remained on board Congress when the galley was driven hard aground, Arnold would have been thankful to have them on board. The shells would contribute to the fire, explosion, and complete destruction of his flagship, and prevent it from falling into his enemy's hands. Their presence may also account for that shell fragment being collected there 100 years later. Amassing vessels and arms for the control of Lake Champlain was an enormous undertaking for the British, and a monumental struggle for the Americans in 1776. It should be no surprise that the expenditure of those arms and the ensuing engagements would reach epic proportions. Indeed, it was an 18th century version of David and Goliath. Considering the scale of their production, it also shouldn't be surprising that manuscript and munitions remain uncovered. Those records and relics will be brought to the surface by greater accessibility, advanced technologies, and continued searches. Undoubtedly, those discoveries will add new elements to the evolving narrative and reconstruction of the 1776 Battle of Lake Champlain. Despite the scavenging of Congress's carcass, this pairing of surviving documentation confirms the deployment of its howitzer. We now know that both forces had the mettle to unleash terror upon one another from all angles, both low and high. In further comparisons of the fleet's mettle, this howitzer should be included among the American weight. Only through further study and survey can we assess whether his Royal ever played an active role in Arnold's defense of Lake Champlain. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank those that have helped make this presentation possible. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum's 2022 Arnold's Bay Survey participants. It's been an honor and a privilege to take part in this survey under the direction of Executive Director Susan Evans McClure and Director of Archaeology and Research Chris Sabick. Many thanks to Assistant Director of Archaeology Sherilyn Gilligan, as well as project participants Patricia Reed, Chelsea Cohen, Ian Shoemaker, and Craig Allen. And it's with special thanks to Craig Allen, a longtime friend and VBRP participant, who was the first to encounter and recognize shell fragments during the survey. It was that discovery which encouraged me to look deeper into the study of their potential historical context. I'd also like to thank researcher George Quintel. George not only played a significant role with the Valcour Bay Research Project in making the historical connection between a fragmented cannon and a tragic accident that occurred upon the gondola New York. It was with his influence as a research partner and mentor that searches for supporting documentation for Arnold's howitzer came to a successful conclusion. I'd also like to thank Valcour Bay Research Project participant Tony Tyrrell for his valuable insights into evidence of howitzer deployment in the vicinity of Valcour Bay's Savage Rock. Thanks to Dr. Matthew Kegel and Margaret Stoddard of Fort Ticonderoga, and to Christine Vallison, Chief Ranger David Lemire, and Interpretive Ranger Bill Vallison of Saratoga National Historic Park for their time and assistance. A very special thanks to Talon Films, Chris Stearns, Tom Mercer, and Anthony Bertucci for their generous support of this presentation by providing segments of their film, Benedict Arnold, Hero Betrayed. It's a thorough presentation of James Kirby Martin's Benedict Arnold, an American warrior reconsidered. It's a film that was a long time in the making, but well worth the wait. For students of the American Revolution, it's a must-see. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that, Ed. That was so interesting.
Thank you.
All right, it's looking like people are asking more about artifacts that you guys have found in that area. Someone wants to know how you're able to differentiate between items found that are linked to the battle compared to similar items that are found in the same area, but could be from years or even decades away from the battle event.
Well, for one thing, there was quite a lapse between the battle and when the area was actually settled. So there's a big difference in the time frame and the materials that we're encountering. Also, we've had a lot of experience with Belcourt Bay. We've also had other people get involved, like Joe Bowie, who's an expert on these kind of things, like Barbieri is another. So we've got a pretty good idea what we're looking at when we find it. And we have found a lot of things that are much later, but there's a significant amount of stuff that has really survived, surprisingly. And that's that we can absolutely attach to the events there in 1776.
Right. Someone is also asking if any research has been done on Button Bay.
Not that I'm aware of. I would not doubt. It was a very contested battle all the way right up until Arnold's Bay. It was a really brave maneuver, but it was a desperate maneuver. There was some heavy shelling in between those ships, especially against the Congress. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of material in there too.
Yeah, and for those that aren't aware, Button Bay is directly north of Arnold's Bay. It's a much larger feature on the lakeshore, and Arnold's Bay is just this little tiny inlet that's just south of it. We do know that Button Bay has not been intensively surveyed in the way that the Valcourt Bay battlefield or Arnold's Bay have at this point. It has been surveyed using sonar technology and diver surveys, but it hasn't been thoroughly investigated with metal detecting in the way that Arnold's Bay or Valcourt Bay have. We do know that the fleet actually paused at Button Bay, or as they called it at the time, Button Mold Bay, when they were heading north before the Battle of Valcourt Island. They got caught in a nasty storm and had to retreat to Button Bay to shelter from the storm, and they actually took the opportunity to have a little cookout on shore and maybe do some target shooting, just while they waited for the storm to blow by and for their fleet to reassemble. But there doesn't seem to have been the level of battlefield conflict in Button Bay as there was at Valcourt or Arnold's Bay.
Great. And we have one more question before we move on that we can get to about howitzers. Someone is asking, is the howitzer that was found similar to those from Fort Ticonderoga?
We don't know. It's actually a ghost. We just have the report that it was found. It was actually offered for sale to a couple of gentlemen down in Boston. And now they're trying to see if we can find out where it went, where it might be now. But I would imagine it was very similar to anything that Fort Time would have.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed.
Sure.
All right, does that make it my turn again? I think so. Okay, we're going to close out today's operations. Thank you, Ed. That was excellent, really interesting stuff, and really shows you that the work that we're doing is still producing new and interesting and relevant history as we continue to expand our understanding of these events of 250 years ago. I'm going to wrap things up today by talking about the one feature within Arnold's Bay that hasn't been discussed in detail up to this point, and that is the remains of the Rogue Galley Congress, which was Benedict Arnold's flagship in 1776. So let me go ahead and get that started here. I can remember how. Okay, and then my presentation. Let me move that out of the way. Okay. Here we have once again one of Ernie Haas's fantastic paintings that is showing the flight from Valcour and the British fleet chasing the Royal Galley Congress. To start off with, once again, Ernie's numerous paintings of the events of 1776 are just a wonderful way to illustrate those happenings, and we're really lucky to have access to them. Of course, I'm going to just back up a little bit and cover some of the history of the row galleys, which is a vessel type that we haven't talked much about yet today. We've been focusing more on the gunboats and those things. So, the construction of the row galleys began during the summer of 1776 after the Americans were retreating from their failed invasion of Canada. And they sought to build a fleet to defend Lake Champlain from the expected invasion by the British forces, who were attempting to control not only Lake Champlain, but also the Hudson River, and therefore have an all-water route or nearly all-water route through the wilderness to divide the colonies by literally, controlling the central corridor through the New England states. And the American shipbuilding effort took place down in Skenesboro, which is modern-day Whitehall, New York. And there, in the early spring of 1776, construction began on the gondolas or the gunboats, like the Philadelphia and the Spitfire that we've talked about before. They started laying down these boats. They were pretty easy to build compared to a more complex fighting vessel like those ones we saw from the British fleet, the Inflexible, and some of those larger vessels. They could be built with relatively small amount of lumber, and you didn't need super skilled shipwrights to construct flat bottom boats that were just carrying a few guns. Arnold, who had been involved in the invasion of Canada, arrived in Skenesboro in July of 1776, and he was given command of the burgeoning fleet there that the Americans were building. And while he appreciated the value of having some gunboats already under construction, and in fact, some being completed already, he also realized that those gunboats are not the world's best fighting platforms. They're not particularly maneuverable. They have square sails, which means they only sail well when the wind is directly behind them. Other than that, you're rowing those boats around. They have guns that are pointing in 3 different directions, which makes them, not the most efficient fighting vessel. And he really encouraged the shipbuilders there to construct larger vessels, some of which had already been laid down in the form of the row galleys. And when he came onto the scene and took over control in the shipyard, he really refocused the efforts of the shipbuilders towards the row galleys, which were much larger vessels. The gunboats are 54 feet long. The row galleys are more like 71, 72 feet long, and can carry up to 10 guns, which are deployed in a broadside like a normal fighting naval vessel. So they were able to concentrate their firepower more easily than you were with the gunboats. They were also equipped with lateen sails, which is a type of fore and aft sail that allowed them to sail better in different types of wind than you had with the square sails of the gunboats. Now, they picked Skenesboro for the shipbuilding effort because Philip Skene, who was a loyalist landholder in the area, had established some very useful sawmills and ironworks, including an iron bloomery in Skenesboro. And the Americans took over his operation there and turned that into the shipbuilding center for the American fleet. Up to this point, the fleet had originally been centered around captured vessels, both from Skene's Manor and also from the American invasion of Canada. When they went through St. John in 1775, they captured the Royal Savage. Some other ship timbers and some other small vessels were brought into the fleet and armed for use as naval vessels. As we previously mentioned, they started as soon as things started to go south in Canada. The folks in Lake Champlain started to build gunboats. They knew they needed something on the lake to help defend this water corridor into the wilderness. So they started with the gunboats. But it was Arnold and, some forward thinking that really suggested they needed to build these larger row galleys, of which they were ultimately able to complete 4 by the time the battle took place, but only 3 of them actually made it to the fleet at Valcour. So at the Valcour, by the time that Valcour Island took place, we had the row galleys Congress, the Trumbull, and the Washington. The Congress, which is obviously going to be the focus of our discussion today, was built by a group of shipbuilders that had traveled up from Philadelphia, led by a gentleman named Thomas Kadsrup, and who had built several similar vessels for the Pennsylvania Navy that helped defend Philadelphia earlier in the war. This is an area of research that I'm really hoping to spend some more time focusing on, because the row galley is a really strange design. The fore and aft lateen rigs sails is a really odd choice from my point of view. They in the early days, these were sometimes referred to as Spanish galleys, which the lateen rig is something that I would normally associate with Mediterranean vessels for the most part. So I'm curious to look into Thomas Kadsrup and the previous vessels that he had worked on, and the other shipbuilders that built the other row galleys, to determine, where did this design come from? Where are the influences in these vessels as they were being built? Beside that point, obviously these fleets came together on October 11th in 1776 at the Battle of Valcour Island. During this battle, the row galleys played a significant role. They exchanged a lot of fire with the British fleet and received a lot of fire at the same time, with all captains of the 3 vessels involved mentioning that they received a significant amount of damage. I know we've seen this painting before today in a couple of other presentations, but I think this is a good indication of how badly damaged some of the row galleys were by the end of the day on October 11th. We have the Philadelphia that's sinking from taking a 24-pound round shot up near the stem that basically passed through the vessel and tore up its internals and let the water in. And the crew from the Philadelphia escaping onto the row galley Washington. I would like you to note that the row galley Washington, which is in the background of this photo, it only has one of those big triangular sails on it now. And that's because the entire foremast had been shot away. So these boats took a significant pounding during the day on October 11th. However, the remains of the American fleet were able to escape on the night of the 11th and fled up the lake south during the day on the 12th. And ultimately, on the morning of the 13th of October, the British fleet, got that northerly wind that Cher mentioned previously and came down on the remains of the American fleet in a heavy way. Now, the Washington was kind of trailing along the rest of the fleet because it had lost that mast and had been so badly damaged. And the British forces were able to capture it about 5 miles south of Split Rock Mountain. Luckily, a significant number of the Philadelphia's crew that had escaped onto the Washington took the opportunity to jump into a bateau and rowed ashore. So they were not captured like the rest of the Washington crew members were. Now, this capture of the Washington is going to end up being important for our discussions further on. So just keep that in mind. The capture of the Washington left Arnold with the Congress and 4 of the gunboats remaining. The third row galley, the Trumbull, apparently seems to have been the best sailor of the bunch, or maybe hadn't been as badly damaged. It actually pulled far enough away from this fragment of Arnold's fleet that it was going to make it down to Fort Ticonderoga without being captured or, without the British catching up with it, along with some of the smaller sloops and schooners that were better sailors. So as things deteriorated for the American fleet, what we were left with was those 4 gunboats and Benedict Arnold's row galley Congress. Realizing that he was going to lose this fleet, and they would become prizes of the British Navy, of the Royal Navy, Arnold directed his remaining vessels into what was then known as Ferris's Bay. And we have this great quote from the Sergeant of Marines aboard the Congress, which mentions that Arnold set the ships on fire, but ordered that the colors not be struck. That means he left the flags flying. And as they grounded, the Marines were directed to jump overboard with their arms and accoutrements. Probably somebody lost a shoe in their shoe buckle, as Cher mentioned, to ascend that bank, that 25-foot bank, and form a line of defense. The enemy, also, as Cher mentioned, was not able to follow the Americans into Ferris's Bay because of the shallow water and their much greater draft that their vessels took. Made them fearful of running aground if they were to follow the American vessels into Ferris's Bay. So they contented themselves with hanging out at the mouth of the bay and firing in at the American vessels and the escaping troops. So we have this, horrendous moment where the vessels are set afire, people are jumping overboard and scrambling ashore with whatever they could carry. There is a very significant bluff at the back end of Arnold's Bay, as Cushing mentioned, about 25 or 30 feet high. So I imagine scrambling up that slope with all your earthly possessions was probably quite a challenge after several days of fighting and running and not sleeping much and trying to stay ahead of the British. And here again, we have this Ernie Haas painting of the British and at the mouth of Arnold's Bay with the American fleet burning on shore. It's hard to rectify the extreme violence that happened at Arnold's Bay with what we find when we visit Arnold's Bay now. It's a beautiful spot on Lake Champlain. It's this great cozy little bay. There is out here on this point, there is actually a public boat launch. Somewhat less impressive, the Vergennes Panton Water District has been added to Arnold's Bay. That's this big, blocky, hideous structure on the shoreline here where they take water from Lake Champlain to service several of the communities around Arnold's Bay. But otherwise, the land and the area around Arnold's Bay has not been developed to an extraordinary amount, which has left such a fantastic archaeological evidence both in the lake and on the shoreline, as Cher discussed previously. Now, and this was something that Ed mentioned briefly, was that, people didn't really forget about these vessels. After they burned, they were still visible for many years because it's very shallow water. It's relatively clear water, and people were able to identify these vessels pretty easily during the 19th century. We have lots of reports of people picking off timbers, cannonballs, howitzers, all kinds of things that they could see from shore. And this is after the British had come back in after the battle and recovered what they could at the time. We know that during the course of the 19th century, 3 of the 4 remaining gunboats were pulled out of the lake and either disassembled for their lumber, maybe used somewhat as curiosities or historic relics, but unfortunately have been lost basically to history. We know that in 1952, the final gunboat was pulled out by Lorenzo Haglund, who is the same gentleman that found the Philadelphia, in Valcour Bay, and the Philadelphia now being on display in the Smithsonian Institute. He recovered this gunboat in 1952 and took it over to the mouth of Ausable, the Ausable River on the New York shore, where he'd hoped to establish a maritime museum that would house those remains, along with the remains of the first steamboat on Lake Champlain, the Vermont 1, that George mentioned during his presentation. Unfortunately, that maritime museum never excuse me, never materialized. The vessel remains rotted and were eventually bulldozed and destroyed. And there's now a KOA campground that sits on top of that site. So we have all 4 of the gunboats are lost to history at this point. The Congress was still visible. We do know that in 1892, the folks that operated the ferry from Arnold's Bay decided to recover a portion of the Congress, and they apparently attached themselves to the stern end of the Congress remains and pulled off this roughly 25-foot section of the stern of the Congress and dragged it ashore. In this other picture, we have a great view from the south bank of Arnold's Bay. You can see the size of the cliff that those soldiers and sailors had to scurry up when they were escaping from the British. And here you can see where the ferry is indicated. This is the sail ferry that the family operated in Arnold's Bay. Now, switching back to this photo of the Congress remains, you can see in the background here, that actually is the sail ferry, telling us that the Congress remains were recovered from the north end of the bay, which is going to play into our story as we move forward. Unfortunately, these remains that they recovered in 1892, they sat here on the shoreline for a while as a historical curiosity. They were eventually transferred down to the hotel that sat on the Vermont side of the Champlain Bridge, or where the Champlain Bridge is located now, which is the Chimney Point Historical Site. And there we lose track of them. They probably rotted and again were disposed of, other than 2 of the floors, which have managed to survive and are now on display at the Maritime Museum. So giving us some idea of what the shape of at least a portion of this stern segment of the Congress looked like. Very happy that we still have those extant. And there are 3-dimensional models of these 2 frames available on our Sketchfab site, as well as the other models that were discussed previously today. In the 1960s, a local avocational archaeology group called the Lake Champlain Archaeological Associates spent 2 summers doing some excavation inside the remains of the forward half of the Congress that was still in Arnold's Bay. And they recovered an amazing collection of artifacts, including shipbuilding tools like this adze, a cold chisel, caulking irons, large drift pins and bolts. We have some personal armament remains here. This is part of a trigger guard from a flintlock musket, a couple of bayonet scabbard belt hooks. This is, kind of like the little pocket clip you have on the back of a small pocket knife, except it was for an 18th century bayonet. And this is part of a hand guard for a small sword. Here, copper handguard or brass handguard. We have lots of glass and ceramic remains also were found in this 1960s excavation. And interestingly, and related to what Ed was discussing, there are a number of mortar or howitzer shell fragments that were found in the 1960s. And these appear to be 8-inch howitzer shells, which would reinforce Ed's thought that some of the British shells were landing and causing significant damage on the American vessels. These are almost certainly evidence of an exploding British 8-inch shell on the Congress that just happened to be in the remains when it was abandoned. This entire collection of artifacts was donated to the Maritime Museum and ultimately to Navy History and Heritage Command, and is now curated at the Maritime Museum on the Navy's behalf. And it's really an extraordinary opportunity to have this collection from the site. It's remained together. It's from Arnold's Bay, and we know it's from the Congress. So it's really great to have this, to access to this collection for comparison with what we're finding currently. In 2001, Maritime Museum staff did some surveying in Arnold's Bay and relocated the remains of the Congress which you can see here, right? Can everybody tell that that's a boat? There's just a couple of planks, a couple of frame heads that stick up out of the bottom of the mud. But that survey did conclusively locate the Congress at the northern end of the bay, as we saw with the recovery of the stern of the Congress in the same general area. Now, when we went back in 2020, we started our survey, or 2021, with we know where the Ferris Homestead is. There was an excavation that was done at the cellar hole of the Ferris Homestead in the 1980s. So we know where that is. We know where the Congress is. We don't know where anything else is. So that was where we started from in 2021 when we started to explore this battlefield in more detail. Pretty quickly, we identified the Congress remains. This is actually that same plank sticking out of the bottom that we saw in the previous picture. And it's articulated to a number of framing components. Those are outside hull planking, and we do have some interior ceiling planking as well in this area. And as I mentioned, inshore of this feature are a number of just kind of frame tips poking up out of the mud. So we had a pretty good idea that this is where the forward half of the Congress remains exist. So we mapped that in, at least, kind of delineated what we think the main piece of structure is there in the lake. And then we set up our transects to collect the artifacts that Cher mentioned in the area around the Congress remains. And as we started to do these transects and to poke around in the harbor, we did encounter the ballast piles that Cher mentioned as well. This is a model of the ballast pile that's located in the stern area of the Congress. Though there doesn't seem to be many structural remains here, there is this really odd, not typical for the environment pile of stones here, which are almost certainly evidence of the ballast stones that were used on the Congress. Directly adjacent and north of the known Congress remains, there is yet another ballast pile. And this is most likely evidence of the excavations there in the 1960s, where one of the participants in those excavations, Bill Leach, who's a longtime friend of the museum and participated in the Valcour Bay Research Project, he mentioned that they were literally, as they dug down into the mud, they were just taking these rocks, these ballast stones, taking them to just beyond the frames and putting them into a pile outside of the excavation. And so that's what led to this large pile of ballast just north of the Congress remains. During the metal detecting survey of the transects, we of course found lots of interesting artifacts, which we heard about from Cher, but we also found a loose floor timber from the Congress, just inshore of the main Congress structure. It's unclear where exactly in the hull this V-shaped floor timber might have come from, but really interesting that we found it. There are a number of other pieces of timber around this floor. It's difficult to ascertain at this point if they are associated with the vessel or not. The whole bay is just chock-a-block full with all kinds of timber that has drifted in there and settled over the years. So it's really difficult to say with any certainty what fragments that we find on the bottom of the lake are actually associated with these vessels. Undoubtedly, some of them are, but unless they're articulated to extant remains, or they have very obvious 18th century fasteners and other features, we have to be very selective about what we take the time to document and record thoroughly, because there's just so much of it. This is obviously a piece of the Congress, though, this floor that was found. And then by September of the summer of 2022, fall of 2022, we had received our permit from Navy History and Heritage Command to carry out initial excavations on the extant hull remains of Congress. We had originally planned to do a much more extensive excavation program, But as the season was coming to a close, we were only able to dedicate 1 week to this initial excavation with hopes that we will continue in the upcoming summer. We worked principally off of Ed Scollin's boat, which is, I think, a 22, 24 foot long pontoon boat. And we used an 18-foot inflatable rafted off to the side, which was actually our dredge barge, where we mounted 2 Honda water pumps, 2-inch water pumps that were used to power the induction dredges that we employed on the lake bottom to excavate a trench across the structure between 2 of those frame heads that we found sticking up out of the mud. Right, and this is what we expected to find, right? What we thought we had was little frame tips sticking up, and as we dug along one of them, we would come across the bottom of the boat, the center line structures of the boat, including the keelson. We didn't actually expect to see the keel because it would be buried, and then you would continue up the other side of the boat and you'd come to the other frame head. That's what we expected. That's what makes sense. But this is what we found. Right, I know this is kind of a grainy shot, and we'll look at much better ones in a second, but from the surface, we have those frame timbers extending across our trench, but there's no center line timbers that we came across. Very perplexing. Well, let's have a look at this short video here of what we found. Let's see, we don't need the sound for that. Okay, this is, we're turning back around here onto the outboard end of these frames. So we're descending from the side of the boat towards the center. There's 4, I think 5 ceiling planks that are here attached to the interior of the vessel above these framing structures. And here is where the other frame tips were sticking up out of the mud at the other end. And they're definitely broken off there. The preservation of the wood is pretty astounding. It's still rock hard. As we go down into look between some of these framing elements, you can still see some very clear indications of the tool marks from when these timbers were shaped and put into the boats. This V-shaped notch in the wood there I find very intriguing. May actually be a builder's mark of some sort. We'll have to see if we find that in any other locations. These are the ceiling planks, which are enormous. The one of them is over 18 inches wide. And here we are at the end of these frames. You can see a iron fastener here on FS7 that's coming through from the outer hull planking. I'm trying to look down here underneath the ceiling planking here. On this frame element, there's actually a trunnel, a wooden peg. So we have a combination of both iron and wooden fasteners on this remains, which are, that's 18th century. That's what we see in lots of Revolutionary War wrecks, is this combination of both wooden fastenings and iron fastenings. So really interesting piece of structure that we uncovered here, but we were still a little baffled as to what exactly we were looking at. But as we dug down further on the one end of it, we came to realize that what we were looking at was not 2 sides of the vessel, but it was one side of the vessel that had broken right at the keel. And we actually dug down deep enough to find the top of the keel. And that's what's numbered number 1 here on the left side of this image of our excavation trench. So what we had was the side of the boat has broken right at the keel and fallen out. And we have the broken heel end of these floors sticking up out of the mud, and then we had the very tips at the outboard edge of the same frames sticking up, about 11 feet away. So this is a pretty significant portion of what we're assuming is the starboard side of the Rogue Galley Congress. Well, it was disappointing that we didn't find the keelson. We did find the keel, which is even better. And as you look down on the keel in this image, I have the keel labeled here. There is actually a hull plank on what would be the port side, and possibly a ceiling plank sticking out of the wall of our trench. Now, we didn't really have the time to continue this trench further in this direction to determine if there were any additional structures off to the side. But that's something we definitely want to look for next time. Let's see what else we got here. One of the really fascinating things about this excavation, and this is one of the powers of photogrammetry, is that we created this, right? I created this 3D model of the trench, and in doing so, it very accurately recorded the curvature of these timbers and the hull in this location. So this is our trench from a profile view, say from an end. So here is the keel. This is the cutout of the keel, and this shape, which is notched out here because this is where the ceiling timbers were, but I imagine that curve could be pretty much transferred directly down to here. This is the curvature of the Congress's hull in this location. So obviously when the boat was built and in use, the keel would have been oriented vertically. So if we rotate this image, right, to where the keel is properly oriented, now we have an idea that this is actually a pretty shapely part of the Congress's hull. Now, returning to our discussion of the capture of the row galley Washington, one thing, sister ship to the Congress, one thing that the British are, thankfully, they did a lot of after they captured vessels was they would record the hull shape of any prizes that they took. And they did this with the row galley Washington. So we have this nice set of lines from the Admiralty Department in England, showing the basic shape and features of the row galley Washington that they captured. Now, assuming that the Washington and the Congress are at least similar in size and shape, I would like to draw your attention to this portion of the lines drawing, which is called the body plan. This is what gives you the cross-sectional shape of this vessel. Right here, we see the curvature of the vessel in the bow, and these sections are each numbered 1, 2, and 3, and they correspond to these 3 vertical lines on this view, 1, 2, and 3. So if we take the curvature of our section that we excavated, which is F6, that's the black line here, and we compare it with the body plan of the row galley Washington, we can see that our frame section fits in really well right between stations 1 and 2 on the Washington plan and follows the curve pretty closely. And that would indicate that the section that we're looking at of the Congress's structure is way up here in the bow, approximately located where this dark blue line is on the Washington drawing. So that fits very well with our assumptions about the orientation of the vessel, that it was bow into the shoreline, that we were, that obviously the stern is gone because it's been broken off and dragged ashore in the 19th century. But what we're looking at is a pretty sharp, at least shaped section of the hull in the very forward end of the Congress, probably about 10 or 12 feet aft of the stem of the vessel. That's pretty exciting. That's pretty cool, and really suggests some interesting ideas of what we're going to find as we excavate further. Another feature to notice about this is the framing itself, right? Within our small trench here, we have 2 floors, right? These are the portions of a vessel's frame that are attached physically to the keel. And then the additional components of the frame are known as futtocks. And futtocks are usually being a loose term, attached directly to the floors so that you have a solid construction of timber going out. What we see here in the Congress is that these are the 2 floors. This is the futtock, and it's not attached to either of the floors. And that was somewhat surprising. This is not a construction feature that I expected to find when we started to look at the Congress. But as you started to think about it and look at other vessels from the region that have been archaeological documented, this is really not an unusual construction style for the Champlain Valley. So here again is a top-down view of our section with the 2 floors and the futtock, the disarticulated futtock in the middle. And this similar framing pattern was seen in the vessel that I did for my thesis, which was a small sailing schooner from Lake Huron that was built in 1789 in Detroit. And what we found with this is called the schooner Nancy. What we found with the Nancy is that she had displayed this open framing system interspersed with more traditional made frames or mold frames. So on the Nancy, every 3rd frame is constructed in the traditional fashion where the futtock is directly adjacent to the floor and attached to it, and actually is attached to the 2nd futtock as well. So I'm assuming that as we excavate more of the Congress, we will come across some of these made or molded frames as well. Because in between each of these molded frames, there's a whole series of, floating frames where you have the floor with the 2nd futtock abutted directly to its end. And in between it, you have a disarticulated floor futtock member like we see in Congress. This was also seen in the sloop Boscawen, which is a French and Indian War sloop that was excavated near Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. We see it in the Duke of Cumberland, which is another French and Indian warship from the Ticonderoga area. Some of the there's a number of small French and Indian War sloops that were recovered from Lake George, like this one here in the lower right, that also seem to show this type of framing pattern. And this framing pattern seems to have persisted into the 19th century because we see it in the remains of the Ticonderoga that George Schwartz mentioned in his discussion of steamboats, because the Ticonderoga, which was originally laid down as a steamboat, was later converted into a war vessel. But it also displays this open framing pattern construction style. So that's, this is the stuff that I love about ship construction and excavation is tracking down these various construction styles and whether we can attribute them to particular builders, to particular traditions, to particular regions of shipbuilding. So this is something that I'm really interested in pursuing further, along with learning more about the men who built the Congress and other vessels that they had built previously. So what's next? What are we going to do next? Right, this is what we have at the moment. I've gone ahead and put the referenced photograph of the excavation trench here in our remains. Our original plan that we had gotten the permit with from the Navy History and Heritage Command was to dig this trench across until we found that center line timbers that we expected to find, and then we would work to either end, and then place a trench at the stern end and at the bow end as well. We've had to reevaluate our research design since we didn't find those center line timbers, or actually we did find them, but they're on the edge of our excavation instead of in the middle. So first step in 2023, when we have the opportunity to return to this site, is to excavate a trench along the keel. So we'll do a longitudinal trench, trying to expose as much of the keel and the heels of the broken floor timbers as we can. Once we've followed that to its terminus at the forward end and as its after end, I'd love to put a trench across the remains of the structure at its stern end. It would be remarkable if we can determine where the fracture happens that allowed the stern to be pulled off and dragged ashore in 1892. And hopefully that would fall into this trench as we dig it. I would also like to put a trench across the bow structure. You know, when you get up into the bow of the vessel, we should encounter portions of the stem and the internal structures that would have supported the very bow of this vessel. We may encounter cant frames, which are not perpendicular to the keel, but are, as the name suggests, canted and at different angles as they round out the bow of the vessel. And probably most intriguingly of all, we need to put a trench out to what's now the port side of the vessel. Is the port side even there? We don't know. What we do know is that unfortunately there's a ballast pile sitting on top of it now because all those rocks were pulled out of the Congress remains in the 1960s and put here. The question is were they put on top of another piece of structure that the folks in the 1960s did not even realize was there? So we will definitely be extending a trench off to the port side through that ballast pile to determine if there are additional remains of the port side of the vessel still extant as well. So we got a lot of work cut out for us. We have secured funding for between 3 and 4 weeks of excavation on Congress this coming summer. And we really can't wait to get out there and do some more work and hopefully be able to share some more interesting and relevant information with you at this time next year. Okay, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Jack, you might have to kick me out of that again because I can't figure out how to. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Chris.
So excited to get back in the water, Chris. That was awesome, thanks.
And we will, this final question and answer session, we'll be happy to answer questions about any of the presentations that occurred today. So let's see what we can do.
All right. How about we start off with some of the questions about our most recent presentation, and then we can try to work our way backwards to everything that we have to circle back to.
Sounds
That's
good.
all right with you guys. Someone is asking, have any of the guns of the Congress been found in the past or recently? And if not, would metal detectors be useful to find the guns?
Well, certainly metal detectors are very effective at picking up huge amounts of metal. So they would be very effective at finding guns. I have little hope of us finding any of the large guns from the Congress. Those were almost certainly recovered by British forces who came back into Arnold's Bay after the fleet burned and spent a considerable amount of time locating and recovering those cannon because just like capturing a vessel and putting it to use in your own fleet, you could do the same with cannon. And they circulated frequently. Capturing other people's cannons was an important way to add, to add to your own force. So I doubt we'll be lucky enough to encounter any of the long guns from the Congress. There's the possibility that the vessel had at least a dozen swivel guns as well, shorter rail-mounted guns. There's the possibility that we might encounter one of those. We certainly didn't during this round of metal detecting, though, because that would make a significant hit for sure.
Right. Some people are asking about the construction of the Congress. So we have someone asking if there's a technical reason why a frame doesn't join the keel.
Well, so where we found a frame is composed of multiple components. The centerpiece of the frame is the floor, and that's the piece that extends across the keel, and that is almost always attached to the keel. So what we found was that the frames that we found in our excavation trench, or the floors we found in our excavation trench, are broken up right at that juncture, or right on the port side of that juncture. So the two floors that we uncovered are bolted directly to the keel.
Awesome. And someone else is asking, would the wood be white oak?
Most likely, yes. That was the preferred shipbuilding timber in the 18th century and later. It was growing increasingly difficult to get hold of good shipbuilding white oak by this point in the American shipbuilding effort. We actually have some reports of the sawyers from Skeensboro having to travel up to 12 miles into the forest to find white oak crooks for making the knees of the gunboats. And I can only imagine that was just as difficult for finding the even larger timbers that they needed for building the framing of the row galleys.
Awesome.
But part of next year's excavation program will be to recover wood samples from the various components and have those wood typed so we can be sure of what types of wood were used in the construction for which components.
Very cool. Someone was asking about the timeline of the different battles, if we want to get into that. So They want to know, after the 1776 battle that you've been talking about and prior to the victory at Saratoga, are there other battles or archaeological sites of interest?
Ed, you want to tackle that one?
There were, but it was more into the interior of Vermont. There wasn't any big major engagement. The British pretty much took control of the lake after the defeat of Arnold's fleet. There was the circumstance in 77 where the British were successful in taking Ticonderoga. At that time, the rest of the fleet vacated. They made a Queensboro, and they burned what they had. Pretty much.
Yeah, so there's it's not a battlefield site. I guess technically it might be, but
Right.
during the retreat from Ticonderoga by American forces across the bridge that connected Fort Ticonderoga with Mount Independence on the Vermont shore, undoubtedly a lot of stuff was dumped off this bridge as these guys ran from Fort Ty and fled south. So there's certainly archaeological remains there that have been examined to some extent, and we hope to return to that area to do some more work in the future with our colleagues from Fort Ticonderoga. But that's about it for significant battles that took place. There were minor skirmishes, raids, and things of that nature, but nothing on the scale of the Valcour and Arnold's Bay conflicts.
Awesome. There's a bunch of questions that are still coming in and that we didn't get to earlier about the Spitfire, if we want to
Okay,
pivot
sure.
to that briefly, just to make sure those people get their questions answered. So someone wants to know who would have named the boat the Spitfire.
Now, this is a really interesting question and one I sadly don't have a great answer for, because all of the other boats are named after states or cities. And then you have this random Spitfire. It's a name that was in use with the British for forever and continued to be right through World War II when they named one of their airplanes Spitfire. So I can only imagine it's just a remnant naming tradition from the past, but
I think they ran out of.
they ran out of good names to use. Right, you have all the gunboats are named Philadelphia and Providence and New York and all of these things. The row galleys, we have Congress, we have Trumbull, which was named after the governor of Connecticut at the time. The shipbuilders that built the Trumbull are actually from Connecticut, so they named it after their own governor. We have the Gates, which is the military, the Continental Military Command in the region. So always a good idea to name a boat after the boss. And then we have the Congress, which of course the Continental Congress was a pretty major feature of the Revolutionary War. But Spitfire is definitely an outlier as far as naming goes. So that's not a great answer, but that's what we have.
Right, and someone else is asking about mussels on the Spitfire. You mentioned zebra mussels, but they're also curious to know about quagga mussels on the Spitfire.
Yeah, at this point, quagga mussels have not been found in Lake Champlain. And while we have not recently recovered samples of mussels from the Spitfire to verify that they are zebra mussels and not quagga mussels, we have to assume that they are not. For those of you who are not familiar with these subspecies of invasive mussels, zebra mussels tend to live in shallower water. Quagga mussels are a very close relative to zebra mussels, have very similar population dynamics in that the population explodes when they move into a new environmental niche. And so if there were quagga mussels, I fear that we would see them everywhere on the Spitfire instead of the isolated zebra mussels that we see, which don't reproduce in that environmental niche as well as quagga mussels would. So as far as we know, there are no quagga mussels in Lake Champlain, and we hope it stays that way. Though they are present in the St. Lawrence, they are present in the Hudson. So it seems like it's only a matter of time before they make an appearance in Lake Champlain. Knock on wood, we've been saying that for 20 years now. So hopefully it remains that way.
Let's hope. Someone else asking about the construction of the Spitfire is wondering about the overhead view you showed with the holes on the frame on both sides of the boat. And this person wants to know if the Spitfire was a row galley.
The definition of what a row galley is confusing, and something that I certainly that we need to look into some more. The terminology used here is much more fluid in the 18th century than it is now, certainly. But I would say that no, the Spitfire was not a row galley. It's a gondola or a gunboat. It was principally a rowed vessel, though. It had probably 18-foot long ash sweeps or oars that would have been used to propel it most of the time when it wasn't sailing with its one miserable little square sail. The row galleys that had the much more efficient lateen rigs did also have the ability to row. So this is where some of the confusion comes into about what constitutes a row galley and what doesn't. If we look forward to the War of 1812, there are a number of row galleys in the American fleet during the War of 1812 that look much more like the Philadelphia than they would the Congress. So once again, it's confusing. But the holes that you're seeing in the cap rail on the outer edge of the Spitfire model, when you're looking straight down on it, are either thole pin holes where those oars would have been positioned, or they're cutouts for where stanchions would have been put. There was an awning frame that went over the boat, and those would have been where those uprights passed through the cap rail into the structure of the boat.
Interesting. Speaking of the War of 1812, someone actually also had a question about the War of 1812.
Okay.
And they were wondering, I believe this was asked when we were talking about the Battle of Lake Champlain and Arnold's Bay and such, but they're wondering, there was a battle during the War of 1812. Where is that in relation to this one?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's the Battle of Plattsburgh Bay you're thinking about, which took place on September 11th of 1814. And strangely enough, it's located at like a couple miles north of Valcour Bay.
3-4 miles, yeah.
Yeah. And the American fleet actually adopted this position during the Battle of Plattsburgh Bay behind Cumberland Head, which is this large peninsula that sticks down into the lake, for exactly the same reasons that Benedict Arnold picked Valcour Bay. The British had to sail south past the headlands of Cumberland Head before coming up into the wind to attack the American fleet, just like Benedict Arnold did with Valcour Island.
There are also some other people who are curious about that kind of time period. Oh, sorry, Cher, did you have?
Oh, sorry. I unmuted at the wrong time. Circle back to me. Finish what you were going to say.
Okay, cool. Someone else is asking whether there have been archaeological surveys of the 1814 naval battle, kind of on the same topic of what we were just talking about.
There have been some avocational surveys of the Plattsburgh Bay battlefield site. In fact, the same archaeological organization, the Lake Champlain Archaeological Association, who did the excavation of the Congress in the 1960s, also did some survey work in Plattsburgh Bay. I think at the same time, maybe in the 70s. Ed, do you know when that work was done?
Well, right here, who could probably tell me that, but yeah, I'm thinking the late 70s,
So they recovered a tremendous amount of material from the bottom of Plattsburgh Bay, which has also made its way to the museum and into Navy collections, which we curate on their behalf. And a lot of really remarkable material from that. Now, the vessels from the War of 1812, both the American and the British fleets, were taken down to the very southern end of the lake, down near Whitehall or Skenesboro, and were laid up in ordinary there, where they eventually rotted away and sank. And some of those one of those was hauled out of the river and is now on display in Whitehall. That's the Ticonderoga that both George and I talked about during our presentations. But there are also remains of one of the War of 1812 row galleys. The Allen is still in the Pulteney River. There's part of the brig Eagle. There's part of the British ship, the Linnet, is there. So there's still, and those were archaeologically documented in the 1990s.
Awesome. Cher, did you have something that I cut you off of, or are we?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I saw a question come in from Jennifer Jones about the gunboat from Ausable Chasm, and if we have a name for that gunboat now. We haven't been able to name anything yet. And I'm not sure if that'll happen, honestly. But that is the 1952 gunboat, yes, Chris?
Yeah, that's the one. And
that's
that's the only name we have for it, unfortunately. We know it's one of the four,
Yeah.
which share is the Boston, the Providence, the
New
New
Haven.
Haven, and the Connecticut, or the Connecticut.
Yeah.
So it's, that narrows it down a little bit, but not very much. And they all look the same from what we know. They're all based on the same design, so there's no distinguishing features that it's going to tell us that one gunboat was a particular vessel or not.
Right. And there's a lot of people also asking about archaeological work on other sites of interest in the lake. Someone is wondering, has there ever been archaeological work done in Whitehall Harbor, where there was a small battle?
Yeah, that one's somewhat depressing. What was left of the American fleet after 1776 retreated to Whitehall or to Skenesboro in 1777 after the capture of Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence by the British. And the vessels were burned and abandoned there, much in the same way they were in Arnold's Bay. But unfortunately, it appears that any remains of those vessels were destroyed when dredging operations happened around Whitehall for the construction of the canal system in that area, because we have not been able to find any bits or pieces of those boats. So some artifacts seem to have been recovered from them at some point that have been in private collection.
Awesome. And then someone is asking more about the Congress project. They want to know, what can we, today's participants, do to further the Congress project?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I have an answer for that. We're super excited that you're super excited about it, and we love that kind of support. So stay tuned, and come out and see what we're finding. At the museum we have a great display about the American Revolution on Lake Champlain, which does have a significant section on the Arnold's Bay events, and we will be working on the artifacts from this excavation for months, let's just say months to come, if not years.
I would encourage people to become members of the museum. Honestly, that's what's helping us along, and it's it's a big deal for the community here, and it helps us do what we do. So consider becoming a member.
Yeah, one of the things that we didn't really touch on that much, but has been an enormously significant part of our operations around Arnold's Bay, is the involvement of the local community. Many of these folks have connections to Arnold's Bay that stretch back generations, and they have local knowledge and experience with the people and the places around Arnold's Bay, and some of them were involved in recovering things from Arnold's Bay in the past. So that's one of the reasons that we are doing these series of virtual conferences, is to share what we've learned with the public, and also in hopes that they will reflect back to us any information that they might have that would be of interest or use in our research as we move forward.
Yeah. And speaking of people who are members of our community, we're getting some questions from people who are familiar with the lake and are sharing some of the things that they've noticed about it. This person is wondering about something that they've seen in the lake when they were fishing. This person says, I live on Button Bay and have fished both Button and Arnold Bay for 20 years. I have seen a feature about 299 yards and 100 yards east. The feature is abruptly south of Button Island and rises from the bottom to about 15 feet below the surface. Could it be a boat mast, or might it be something else in the lake?
Yeah, I can't say that I'm specifically familiar with that feature. There is some very dramatic geology in that area, and of which Button Island is an example. And it's quite possible that that's just a rock outcropping that comes up very shallow in Lake Champlain. not an uncommon feature in Lake Champlain, which is why we have a lot of shipwrecks. But I don't think it's a boat or a boat mast. While we haven't done intensive archaeological examination in the same manner that we've done in Valcour and Arnold's Bay, in Button Bay, we have conducted sonar surveys in that area and would have detected a vessel of that nature if there was one.
Right. Some other people are
Probably a
wondering
good place
about,
to fish, though. Good fishing.
yeah, some people are wondering about other parts of the lake as well. One person is asking about Cumberland Bay and whether the ships sunk in the Battle of Plattsburgh have been researched.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, there weren't really any boats that were sunk in Plattsburgh Bay. They were all, the Americans actually won that battle as opposed to the battle on Valcour Island, captured the entire British fleet, but then it was all taken down to the southern end of the lake, where it was considered safer from being recaptured by any attempts by the British to reinvade the Champlain Valley. And then they were just left there and eventually rotted and sank. So what's left in Cumberland Bay, in Plattsburgh Bay, is battlefield scatter, like we're finding in Arnold's Bay.
All right, very interesting. Some other people are asking about some specific boats that they've heard of that are in the lake. This person is saying that they have a postcard of a shell of a boat and it's captioned the hull of Benedict Arnold's warship, the Revenge, at Fort Ticonderoga, and they want to know if this still exists.
Yeah, this actually I showed a picture earlier when I was discussing the use of the open framing floating frame technique in other vessels in Lake Champlain. And one of those pictures was from the shore of Ticonderoga. When I think it was 1907, they recovered a ship hull from the King's Shipyard, which is right there off the shoreline at Fort Ticonderoga, which they believed was the Revolutionary warship, the Revenge, which is probably what this postcard is indicating. It turns out that after some further work and research, that boat was actually the Duke of Cumberland, which is an older vessel from the French and Indian War, and not the Revenge at all. And unfortunately, it was also brought up onto the shoreline and put on display, and eventually it rotted away and there's nothing left, or there's, fasteners and iron bits left, but that's about it. Some great
Is that
photographs.
one of the boats, sorry to interrupt you, is that one of the boats that we've got a 3D model of now from photographs?
Did
Dan Bishop do that work?
That's right. Dan Bishop has been doing some work. Another colleague of ours from Texas A&M University has been doing some work in creating 3D models, or at least portions of 3D models like photogrammetry, but using historic photographs. How can we use historic photographs to gather ship construction data into an actual three-dimensional shape? And the Duke of Cumberland / Revenge is one of the vessels that we have multiple photographs of once it was pulled out of the lake. So those have been useful in trying to suss out some shape information from that boat by Dan Bishop.
Interesting. And then another person is asking about the Phoenix 2 by Shelburne Shipyard, and they want to know if there could be ballast stone covering this boat.
Yeah, I wish George was on to answer this one. The Phoenix 2 was.
Chris, I'm here.
Oh yeah.
Sorry.
Are you aware of ballast material associated with either the Phoenix or the Phoenix 2?
No, I think that the stuff on Phoenix 2, those were large, like stones of granite that were purposefully placed on the vessel to scuttle, like when they were ready to sink the vessel. Because I remember there was a large effort in removing all those so that you could get to the timbers.
Mostly by Ed.
By Ed did a lot of that. So no, and then on Phoenix there wasn't any kind of ballast because with the steam machinery and all that stuff is really heavy. The boilers and the cylinders and all the bed timber, like all that stuff really did a good job in ballasting the steamers. So there really isn't a lot of information on additional ballast that was placed on it. They probably would have done it as needed, but for the most part, I think that steam machinery covered a good portion of that.
Yeah, there's also some suggestion that the rocks that were found in the Phoenix 2 at Shelburne Shipyard may have, they may have been incorporated into a pier or a dock structure of some sort. And also, as George mentioned, just to make sure that it stayed down. Once it went down, they wanted it to stay there. So that was all seems to have been added in after it sank to the bottom.
Awesome. There's a couple more people asking about different archaeological sites and what kind of work you guys are doing. Someone is wondering, do you have any field work or collaborations with the people doing field work in Lake George?
We do. There's not a whole lot of active archaeology going on in Lake George at the moment. There was an organization called Bateau Below that did a lot of really excellent work. From the 70s on. They have been a little bit quiet of late. There is certainly a significant number of really important wrecks in Lake George, dating back well into the French and Indian War. So we're, and as Lake George drains into Lake Champlain, it's all part of the Champlain watershed. So we are certainly always interested in looking at ships from Lake George and in being involved in any underwater archaeology that's happening there, but there's not a whole lot that's active at the moment, unfortunately. Lake George is a much better place to dive, though. It's really beautiful, nice clear water.
I still haven't been in there.
Oh, you gotta go! It's fantastic.
It's crazy
Compared to Lake Champlain, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, someone else is wondering about whether the museum plans to do any archaeology around the drawbarges in Bulwaga Bay or near the Ticonderoga Ferry.
Not currently. Both of these locations that are mentioned in this discussion are where there are railroad trestles that cross significant portions of Lake Champlain. And in the middle of these railroad trestles, they would actually have, instead of a drawbridge, they would have a barge that had railroad tracks on it, that the train would come off the trestle, go across the barge, and then up the other side. The idea being that you could pivot that barge out of the way if there were boats that needed to go through. And I know the drawbarge in Bulwaga Bay is absolutely enormous. It's like 150 feet long or something. It's this massive structure. And we have some basic information on it and a couple of drawings of it. The ones down near the Ticonderoga Ferry, that is the Chipman Point, Willows Point crossing, where again, this train trestle went across the lake. What's really fascinating about this one is that there are actually 3 of these draw boats that were used at different points during the 19th century. And they were eventually damaged or burned or disposed of and replaced, but all 3 of them are still there, sunk near the trestle at Willows Point. So actually, Ed and I were down there late last fall collecting some sonar data, and we got some good sonar images of some of those draw boats and the trestles. But we don't have any current archaeological plans for those vessel remains. There's too much. There's just too much stuff out there to do. Too much cool stuff to look at.
Job security.
Yeah, job security.
Yeah, and then someone else has a question that is not necessarily related to today's presentations, but they're wondering about other archaeological sites in the area. They're wondering if there are any significant archaeological evidence from the Underground Railroad in the area or in the lake itself that you might know of.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of, but it is something that we've been discussing at the museum lately, because obviously many folks on the Underground Railroad were looking to escape into Canada. And the lake is a natural and easy avenue into Canada. And there was lots of shipping going back and forth across the border. It would have been a very easy method of transportation for a couple of formerly enslaved people to hide out on one of these boats and get carried across the border without anyone noticing. But there's no archaeological evidence of that. There might be historical evidence, and that's the stuff we're looking for now. We have luckily a number of great organizations in the Champlain Valley that focus on the Underground Railroad, at least portionally, like the Rokeby Museum in Ferrisburg. That, you know, they definitely have evidence of Underground Railroad participation at that homestead just north of the Maritime Museum. So it was certainly that kind of stuff was happening in the Champlain Valley, but we don't have any fantastic archaeological evidence in the lake for it, at least yet, maybe.
All right, there's another question that just came in about the Phoenix paddle wheels. This person is wondering, is it possible that the steam engine and the boiler were salvaged, and when brought up to a barge, the damaged paddle wheels came with it and were simply cut free so that they would sink in a different location?
So what we know is that when shortly after the vessel wrecked on the reef, the steamboat company went back out and they actually did salvage the steam machinery and the boilers, and a local ironworks actually received those boilers. We have a written documentation of that, and the cylinder itself, the engine, went on to Phoenix 2, and so it continued to be used. So we don't, but there's no indication that those sort of all failed at the same time.
Yeah, and this is really, honestly, I think the best thing about the whole Phoenix story is that the engines, the heart of the Phoenix 1, were taken and put into the Phoenix 2. It was reborn from the ashes, just like the Phoenix myth in general. So you couldn't create that. You couldn't make that up if you wanted to. Fantastic. Well, we can easily be reached through the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum's website. If anybody else has additional questions or wants to bring anything to our attention, we would look forward to hearing from you in the future. I want to thank all of our panelists for their excellent presentations. I think this was maybe even better than the first one. I think they were all really informative, and y'all did a great job. So thank you, and thank you to the audience for spending the afternoon with us. We really enjoyed presenting this information to you, and we hope to do so again next year.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing all of your great research, and thank you to everyone who was able to come out today.
We're sending a link of the recorded presentations. Yes, I feel like I saw a few
Yes.
questions like that come through. So
Yeah, the presentations are all recorded, and we're going to be getting that up on YouTube in the next couple of days and sharing the link on our socials when it becomes available.
great.
Perfect. So it'll be around for people to watch in the future if you want to.
All right. Thank you all so much. Good evening.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Hey.